In the northernmost reaches of medieval Europe, where the sun hangs low in the sky and icy winds sweep across snowbound plains, life unfolded in a rhythm dictated by cold, frost, and the ever-present threat of winter. Here, in lands as far as Scandinavia, Iceland, the frozen edges of Siberia, and the towering Alps, survival was a daily negotiation with nature itself. Every breath was a cloud of mist, every step a cautious measure against ice and snow, and every day carried the quiet weight of human resilience. Imagine the scene: villages cloaked in white, timber-framed homes huddled together against the wind, smoke curling from hearths, and the faint clatter of boots across frozen paths. The people who inhabited these lands understood the cold not merely as weather, but as an omnipresent force shaping their world. Their lives were governed by the slow passage of seasons, by the hunt, by the careful storage of food, and by the rituals and stories that brought warmth to hearth and heart alike. Each day, each task carried significance. Every preserved fish, every layer of fur, every fortified home was a testament to human ingenuity and endurance. Yet even amidst hardship, the rhythm of life maintained moments of beauty and reflection. Winter festivals marked the passage of time. Songs and tales echoed around fires, and the flickering candlelight illuminated interiors heavy with warmth and companionship. Work and survival intertwined with community, faith, and subtle artistry. Hand-carved tools, embroidered garments, and careful construction of shelters, all revealing the quiet sophistication of human effort against extreme cold. Through this journey, we will explore how medieval people adapted to some of the harshest environments in Europe, how they preserved life, tradition, and culture under frost and snow, and how courage, creativity, and resilience became essential companions. Step into the frozen frontiers where every winter tested the limits of human endurance, yet gave rise to profound stories of survival, ingenuity, and quiet triumph. Join us as we trace the slow, immersive story of life in the coldest regions of the medieval world. Observe their homes, their clothing, their food, and the enduring spirit that carried them through the longest, harshest winters. Like, share, and subscribe to journey with us into a world where the frost shapes life, culture, and history in ways that echo through time. The first snow of winter had already begun its slow descent upon the northern landscapes. In Scandinavia, a thin layer of frost coated the timbered roofs of small villages, turning every ridge and eave into delicate filigree of white. The wind, sharp and unyielding, carried a bitter chill that clung to the skin and crept under layers of wool and fur. It was in these lands where the sun barely crested the horizon in midwinter, and rivers froze before the eye, where the lives of medieval inhabitants were dictated not by hours on a clock, but by the pulse of the seasons, the whispers of the wind, and the demands of survival. In Iceland, settlements huddled along fjords, their walls thick with turf and stone. Smoke rose from chimneys in spiraling columns, a sign of warmth and life, but also a reminder of the constant labor required to maintain it. Families shared the heat of the hearth, the body warmth of livestock, and the comfort of routine in a world dominated by cold. Even as the bitter air sliced across exposed faces, children laughed and ran across packed snow, their movements deliberate yet joyful, their eyes bright with curiosity and the thrill of living on the edge of nature's harshest elements. Further east, the frozen plains of Siberia stretched in vast, unbroken silence, broken only by the distant howl of wolves or the rhythmic crunch of sleds over hardened snow. Nomadic tribes, ever adaptable, moved in accordance with the shifting patterns of ice and snowfall. Reindeer were herded along ancient paths, their hooves ringing over frozen ground. Tents of thick hides were pitched near smoke-filled fires, and in these humble shelters, life carried on with a quiet determination that defied the severity of the climate. Every action, cutting wood, melting snow for water, repairing fur garments, was performed with meticulous care, each one a necessary measure against a season that could claim life as easily as it preserved it. In the Alps, Snow-capped peaks loomed over small hamlets, where stone houses were anchored to the mountainside, resisting avalanches and frost. Mountain passes became treacherous with ice and wind, and travelers moving from one settlement to another relied on guides and knowledge passed down for generations. Merchants bringing salt, cloth, or metals moved slowly, their carts burdened with both goods and the knowledge of survival in temperatures that could fall below the threshold of human comfort. Even short journeys demanded preparation, layers of furs, boiled leather boots, and carefully wrapped supplies. The mountains, grand and imposing, dictated the rhythm of human life with silent authority. The landscape itself was a teacher. Frozen rivers, like the mighty Volga or Norway's glacial tributaries, reflected the muted sunlight, warning of danger beneath the ice, while providing pathways across otherwise impassable terrain. Snowfields offered both sustenance and peril, a supply of water when melted, but also the threat of avalanches and hidden crevasses. Trees, gnarled and stoic, bent under the weight of ice and snow, providing firewood but demanding labor to fell and transport. Each element of the environment shaped daily life, crafting a society where adaptation was not a choice, but a necessity. In these coldest reaches, the human spirit intertwined with the natural world in ways rarely seen in milder climates. Settlement patterns followed the availability of shelter, water, and arable land protected from frost. Communities clustered tightly, both for warmth and mutual support, creating networks of dependence that were as much social as they were practical. The cold dictated more than survival; it structured culture, social hierarchy, and even spiritual practices. Festivals and rituals were often aligned with solstices and equinoxes, marking both the passage of time and the collective endurance of people against an environment that demanded respect. Even the very act of sleep was governed by frost and fire. Beds were layered with furs, floors insulated with straw, and families often slept together in shifts or clusters to conserve warmth. Animals shared the same spaces, their body heat providing an additional buffer against the relentless cold. The medieval mind, attuned to cycles of light and darkness, understood that survival required constant awareness, preparation, and careful attention to the smallest details. Yet, despite the severity of these frozen frontiers, life was not without its quiet pleasures. The hush of snowfall, broken only by the occasional creak of timber or the distant call of a hunter, created a rhythm of existence both harsh and meditative. The stars above, brilliant in the clear, frigid air, guided travelers and inspired awe alike. Fires flickered against the walls of homes, casting dancing shadows on fur-lined interiors. Children's laughter and the soft murmur of conversation reminded all that human warmth, both physical and social, could thrive even in landscapes that seemed inhospitable. Here, at the edge of the known medieval world, the cold was a teacher, a master, and a constant companion. It shaped not only the bodies but the minds and spirits of those who lived here. In the frozen frontiers, every day was a negotiation with nature, a testament to resilience, and a reflection of the ingenuity required to carve a life from ice and snow. This is where our journey begins, in the lands where winter ruled, shaping every choice, every structure, and every life in the slow, deliberate rhythm of survival. As the winter deepened, the northern landscapes transformed into a world of muted light and endless white. The forests, once alive with the green of summer, now stood silent beneath thick layers of snow, their branches bowed and heavy. The rivers, slow to freeze at first, eventually hardened into solid paths, allowing travel over their frozen surfaces but also carrying hidden danger. Ice could crack unexpectedly, swallowing feet and sleds alike, teaching caution in every movement. In this realm, every step, every journey required attention, skill, and patience, qualities cultivated over lifetimes and passed from parent to child, hunter to apprentice. In the settlements scattered across Scandinavia and Iceland, daily life revolved around fire and the tasks necessary to maintain warmth. Smoke curled endlessly from stone chimneys, and the air within homes was heavy with the scent of burning peat and wood. Men chopped timber for fuel, their axes biting into frozen trunks with a sharp, satisfying rhythm. Women tended to the interiors, mending furs, preparing dried fish and salted meat, and layering blankets over sleeping areas to preserve precious heat. Children learned early the arts of resilience, stacking firewood, feeding animals, and navigating the icy lanes without falling. From the first steps of life, they were instructed in the subtle dance between human effort and the whims of nature. Beyond the villages, hunters and trappers moved silently across the snow-covered plains. They followed the tracks of elk, reindeer, and foxes, reading the landscape as if it were a text written in frost and ice. Their eyes, sharp against the reflective glare of snow, learned to discern signs invisible to the untrained observer. The subtle depressions marking a den, the faint scent of animals carried on cold wind, the shimmer of ice indicating a water source below. Each successful hunt was vital, not merely for sustenance, but for survival. Meat was shared, hides crafted into garments, and bones repurposed into tools. In these frozen frontiers, skill was survival, and every action had lasting consequence. Life in Siberia carried its own rhythm, dictated by snowdrifts and the migratory patterns of reindeer. Nomadic families traveled in slow caravans, dragging sleds heavy with provisions and furs. Tents of thick hides offered protection from wind-driven snow, and fires burned constantly, smoke curling into the gray sky. Even routine tasks, melting snow for water, repairing sled runners, tending to animals, demanded concentration and effort. In these lands, human ingenuity met extreme environment, and the lessons of endurance, patience, and meticulous preparation were taught not in books, but in the harsh language of ice and frost. In the high Alps, isolated hamlets clung to slopes, where avalanches were an ever-present threat. Paths connecting villages were treacherous, and travelers often relied on guides who understood the secret codes of snow, ice, and shadow. Merchants brought goods in slow caravans, moving only when conditions permitted. Each journey was carefully planned, furs layered over linen, boots reinforced against frost, supplies rationed to last the duration. The mountains dictated the pace of life, and all who inhabited these regions learned humility in the face of their grandeur and danger. Even within these harsh landscapes, communities fostered warmth through ritual and routine. Inside homes, meals were simple but sustaining. Salted fish, dried berries, bread baked in clay ovens, and strong ale that warmed the body and spirit alike. Stories were told by the fireside, recounting legendary hunts, past winters, and ancestors' survival against seemingly insurmountable odds. Children absorbed these narratives, learning the lessons of courage, cunning, and perseverance. Festivals, often brief and intimate, provided respite from the monotony and danger of winter, bringing communities together to mark the passage of time and celebrate endurance. The natural environment itself was both ally and adversary. Snow and ice provided paths and sustenance, but also threat. Frozen rivers allowed transport, yet could betray the unwary. Dense forests offered shelter, yet concealed predators and hidden obstacles. Understanding the land, respecting it, and living in rhythm with its patterns became the cornerstone of life. Every household, every hunter, every traveler carried this knowledge, passed down orally and through observation, creating a living archive of adaptation. Isolation was another defining aspect of these frozen frontiers. Winter could last for months, cutting off villages from neighboring settlements. The communication between communities was slow, reliant on long journeys that tested both endurance and courage. Letters were rare, and news traveled with travelers or traders, delayed by snowstorms and frozen passes. Yet in this isolation, a strong sense of communal reliance emerged. Families shared resources, labor, and stories. Trust and cooperation were essential. The cold demanded it, and those who failed to respect it could pay with life itself. Each task, each journey, each small success contributed to a rhythm of existence that was slow, deliberate, and intimately connected to the land. The cold shaped everything: clothing, architecture, diet, social relations, and even spiritual practices. Here, humanity endured not through conquest, but through adaptation, ingenuity, and resilience. The frozen lands of the medieval North stand as a testament to the quiet, persistent will of people who learned to thrive where warmth was scarce and danger constant. It is here, among the frost-laden forests, snowbound rivers, and ice-clad mountains, that the story of life in the coldest regions of the medieval world begins to unfold, one patient, deliberate day at a time. The chill of winter extended far beyond the first frost. In the northernmost reaches of Europe, where the sun barely climbed the horizon, winters stretched longer, and the land remained locked in ice far into what would elsewhere be considered spring. By the late medieval period, these regions had entered a slow but relentless cycle of cooling, part of what later scholars would call the Little Ice Age. The cold was not sudden, it crept in gradually, season by season, year by year, but its presence reshaped the very rhythm of daily life. Every decision, from planting crops to building fires, bore the imprint of persistent frost and shortened summers. In the villages of Scandinavia, the signs of the changing climate were unmistakable. The rivers froze earlier, sometimes remaining locked in ice until late April, delaying travel and trade. Fishing, a lifeline for many coastal settlements, became unpredictable as frozen fjords trapped nets beneath ice sheets. Farmers, accustomed to a rhythm of planting, tending, and harvest, found that spring thaws arrived later than in years past. The growing season was shorter, unpredictable, and unforgiving. A sudden cold snap could ruin an entire crop, leaving granaries dangerously thin and communities vulnerable to hunger. Homes, too, reflected adaptation to prolonged cold. Walls were thickened, roofs reinforced, and insulation added wherever possible. Straw and animal hides were layered on floors and ceilings. Hearths burned almost continuously to stave off the frost that sought to creep inside. Families slept in clusters, huddled for warmth, their bodies generating a heat that neither firewood nor sun could fully provide. Children learned early the intimate relationship between human warmth and survival, and their play often involved layered clothing and cautious movements on icy paths. Even routine activities like carrying water or tending animals required preparation, planning, and a careful awareness of the biting cold. The cold extended its influence to every facet of life. Livestock, essential to survival, demanded greater care. Sheep, goats, and cattle required shelter and fodder through months of snow and ice. Grazing was limited. Hay had to be stockpiled meticulously during short, fleeting summers. Farmers learned to ration supplies, alternating feed to ensure no animal starved during the most severe months. Horses, crucial for travel and trade, were kept near stables, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. The entire ecosystem of human activity shifted under the persistent dominance of winter. In Iceland and Greenland, early settlements struggled with even harsher conditions. Ice storms could descend without warning, covering homes and pastures in layers of frost. Water sources froze solid, requiring inhabitants to melt snow for drinking and cooking. Crops that survived elsewhere failed completely here, forcing communities to rely heavily on preserved food, salted fish, dried meat, and stored grains. The cold dictated everything from the materials chosen for clothing and footwear to the timing of festivals and communal gatherings. Life became a measured negotiation with the elements. Even the forest itself, a source of fuel and game, presented challenges. Trees, weighed down by snow and ice, were difficult to fell. Fallen timber could be buried beneath drifts for weeks. Hunting for deer, elk, and smaller animals required extraordinary skill and patience. Traps had to be carefully maintained, tracks read with precision, and journeys across frozen terrain undertaken with caution. Every successful hunt not only provided nourishment, but also offered material for warmth and protection. Failure in this frozen climate could be fatal. The Little Ice Age also transformed social life. Villages became more insular as travel grew hazardous. Neighbors relied more heavily on one another for survival. Seasonal migrations of traders and messengers were curtailed, reducing the flow of goods and news. In these circumstances, communal rituals, celebrations, and storytelling took on heightened significance. Fireside tales, passed from elders to youth, were more than entertainment. They were repositories of survival knowledge, cataloging the wisdom of generations who had endured winters harsher than anyone alive might recall. Religious observances adapted to climate as well. Saints were invoked not only for spiritual guidance, but for the practical blessings of warmth, protection, and bountiful harvests. Candlelight illuminated monasteries and homes, the glow a constant companion against long nights that stretched for 16 hours or more. Pilgrimages became more perilous. Even journeys of a few leagues could be life-threatening during blizzards or freezing storms. Yet people persevered, driven by faith, community, and the enduring need to adapt to an environment that tested every skill, every decision, and every ounce of patience. Cold was not merely an element, it was a master. It dictated the pace of life, the structure of society, and the flow of daily activity. Every aspect of human existence, from farming and hunting to travel, social interaction, and religious devotion, was shaped by persistent frost and shortened growing seasons. Understanding this climate is crucial to appreciating how medieval communities survived and even thrived in some of the harshest regions Europe has ever known. As the cold deepened, medieval communities learned that adaptation required both ingenuity and endurance. The Little Ice Age did not merely chill the air, it reshaped the very rhythm of life. Farmers and herders adapted their schedules to the frost, recognizing that every day lost to snow or frozen ground had consequences for food, trade, and survival. Fields that might have supported 2 crops in milder times now barely yielded one. Livestock required constant attention. Cattle had to be sheltered, sheep carefully herded, and horses fed to maintain strength for transport across ice and snow. In northern Iceland, where winter descended with relentless force, families developed systems to maximize limited daylight and conserve heat. Homes were clustered for communal warmth. Walls thickened with turf and stone to insulate against icy gales. Fires burned continuously in hearths, and the smoke that curled from chimneys signaled not only warmth but the labor that sustained it. Within these homes, life was deliberate and measured. Every task from cooking to clothing preparation was calculated to conserve energy and ensure that the household survived the long months when frost dominated both earth and sky. Travel, even within a village, became a calculated endeavor. Snow-covered paths slowed movement, while hidden patches of ice threatened falls and injury. In the mountains, avalanches were an ever-present hazard, and passes that connected settlements became treacherous during heavy snowfall. People learned to read the land carefully, noting subtle changes in snow texture, ice thickness, and wind direction. Even small mistakes, misjudging a frozen river or ignoring a snow-laden slope, could have severe consequences. Survival demanded attention, patience, and respect for the environment's invisible rules. Food scarcity remained a constant concern. The shortened growing season forced reliance on preservation. Salted fish, smoked meats, dried grains, and fermented dairy became staples. Storage was meticulous, with barrels, bins, and earthen pits designed to protect provisions from frost, pests, and spoilage. Every ounce of food was precious, every meal carefully rationed during the darkest months. In coastal communities, fishing required ingenuity. Nets had to be cut free from ice, holes drilled through frozen fjords, and catches preserved for long winters. Inland, hunting provided protein and hides, but it demanded skill, patience, and knowledge of animal behavior in snowbound forests. Even the simplest clothing became critical to survival. Layers of wool, furs, and hides insulated against the cold, while leather boots, mittens, and scarves protected extremities from frostbite. Families often began winter preparation in late summer, tanning hides, weaving thick fabrics, and crafting garments that could withstand the harshest conditions. Clothing was more than decoration. It was armor against death, a silent yet persistent protector that allowed medieval people to function in an environment that would overwhelm the unprepared. The harsh climate also influenced social and cultural life. Villages were tightly knit, relying on cooperation and shared labor to survive. Festivals and rituals, often aligned with seasonal cycles, provided relief from the monotony and danger of winter. Candlelit gatherings, songs, and storytelling reinforced social bonds, while religious observances invoked protection and blessings for survival. Even in isolation, the human spirit sought continuity, ritual, and connection. A recognition that resilience was not just physical, but social and emotional as well. Children grew up intimately acquainted with frost and snow. Play often involved navigating icy surfaces, helping with tasks that seemed perilous, and learning the patterns of animals and weather. Knowledge was passed down orally, embedded in stories of previous winters, legendary hunts, and survival feats. These narratives were not simply entertainment. They were education, conveying strategies and wisdom critical to enduring the climate. Every tale, every lesson, reinforced the understanding that the cold was both a teacher and a constant challenge. The natural world remained a powerful presence. Rivers, forests, and mountains dictated schedules and routines. Ice could be a pathway, but also a trap. Snow, a cover for danger, and storms, a reminder of nature's dominance. Yet within these limitations, humans displayed remarkable ingenuity. Tools, sleds, stoves, and shelters evolved to meet environmental demands. Communities adapted their work, trade, and social life to align with seasonal constraints. Life became a slow, deliberate negotiation with the climate, where foresight and careful planning determined survival. The impact of the Little Ice Age on medieval northern communities is clear. It shaped architecture, clothing, food, social structure, and even belief systems. Every action was measured against the cold. Every success a small triumph against a relentless, invisible adversary. In these frozen lands, medieval people cultivated resilience, creativity, and a profound respect for the forces that shaped their existence. Their lives were slow, deliberate, and intimately connected to the land, a testament to human endurance in the harshest conditions Europe has ever known. In the frozen north, where winds scoured the landscape and snow accumulated in towering drifts, the home was both sanctuary and survival instrument. Stone, timber, turf, and thatch became shields against relentless frost, a carefully balanced blend of natural materials and human ingenuity. In Scandinavia, timber-framed longhouses rose from the frozen soil, their thick beams dark with age and the constant touch of smoke. Roofs were steep, designed to shed snow before it crushed walls and timbers, and overhangs provided shelter from driving wind and ice. Inside, hearths burned steadily, their warmth diffused through central open spaces where families gathered to cook, mend garments, and share the quiet comfort of company. Every element of construction served a purpose. Walls were often double-layered with sod or stone, insulating against the penetrating cold. Floors were insulated with layers of straw or rushes, their golden hues muted under furs and rugs that retained heat. Windows, small and set deep within thick walls, minimized drafts while allowing the muted winter light to penetrate. Smoke from central hearths wound its way through chimneys or simple vents, providing both warmth and a subtle method of ventilation that kept interiors livable without extinguishing precious fires. In these homes, warmth was currency, carefully managed and distributed, shared between human bodies, livestock, and the glowing hearth. In Iceland and Greenland, settlers relied on a combination of stone, turf, and driftwood, their homes low and rounded to withstand fierce winds. Walls thick with turf, acted as living insulation, trapping heat in winter while maintaining cooler interiors in fleeting summer months. Roofs were often layered with additional turf, moss, and earth, their weight anchoring homes against storms that might rip away weaker structures. Inside, spaces were multifunctional. Cooking, sleeping, crafting, and storage were all contained within a single room. Livestock were kept in adjoining stalls, their body warmth diffusing through walls and floors, supplementing the heat of fires and human presence. Even in the Alps, stone cottages perched on steep slopes used local materials to combat frost and snow. Roofs were sharply pitched, often layered with wooden shingles, and overhangs were supported with stout beams. Interiors were low-ceilinged to preserve warmth, with central hearths radiating heat to every corner. Windows were minimal, sometimes covered with oiled parchment or cloth, to block drafts while letting light through. Furniture was sparse but functional. Benches, tables, and storage chests, all crafted from timber, placed strategically to maximize space and preserve warmth. Families slept together in clusters on raised platforms or on thick mattresses, insulated by layers of wool, furs, and straw. Building a home in these cold climates was labor-intensive and strategic. Timber had to be harvested and seasoned, stone quarried and transported, and sod cut and layered carefully. Every nail, peg, and beam was a decision, each one impacting the structure's ability to withstand snow, ice, and wind. Construction often took months, beginning in the fleeting warmth of summer, when the ground was soft enough to dig and timber could be worked with precision. By the time winter descended, homes had to be fully prepared to endure months of frost, isolation, and storms. Interiors were adapted for both comfort and utility. Firewood was stacked near the hearth, dried and ready to burn for months. Cooking vessels were kept within reach, and storage areas were designed to prevent spoilage of preserved foods, shielded from frost yet ventilated to avoid dampness. Beds were layered with furs and straw, often raised on platforms to protect sleepers from cold floors. Even small touches, like hanging cloths to block drafts or arranging stones to radiate heat from the hearth, were carefully considered. Survival depended as much on interior planning as on the external strength of walls and roofs. In northern Siberia, nomadic families developed portable homes designed for mobility and insulation. Thick animal hides were stretched over wooden or bone frames, forming conical tents that could withstand heavy snow and wind. Interiors were compact, with central hearths providing warmth and a place to cook. Floors were layered with furs, and sleeping arrangements were carefully organized to share body heat. These dwellings, while less permanent than stone or timber houses, reflected the same principles: protection from cold, conservation of heat, and the intelligent use of available materials. Communities also arranged homes strategically. Villages were clustered on sheltered slopes, along riverbanks, or near natural windbreaks. Structures were oriented to minimize exposure to prevailing winds, maximize sunlight in short winter days, and maintain proximity to essential resources like water, firewood, and pastures. In more isolated settlements, homes might be few, but each was carefully sited for survival, their placement as critical as their construction. The landscape dictated design, and human ingenuity found ways to harmonize with its challenges. Even small touches reflected an intimate understanding of the cold. Doorways were narrow to conserve heat, while thresholds were raised to block drifting snow. Hearths were positioned centrally but often supplemented by smaller alcoves or braziers. Floors were covered with rushes, straw, or furs, sometimes layered multiple times to trap warmth. Livestock were kept within or adjacent to living spaces, their heat radiating through walls and floors. Every element of the home was a response to the cold, a deliberate, cumulative effort to create a space where life could continue despite winter's dominance. Within these frozen fortresses, human life was deliberate and slow, a rhythm shaped by the cold. Cooking, cleaning, tending animals, and crafting clothing all revolved around the preservation of warmth. Tasks were undertaken with precision, as wasted effort could cost heat or even survival. Children learned early to respect both their homes and the environment, observing elders as they maintained fires, reinforced walls, or repaired thatch. Every day was an exercise in endurance, planning, and attention to detail, yet also in quiet domestic intimacy, the warmth of hearth and family sustaining both body and spirit. As winter deepened, the importance of well-prepared homes became even more evident. Snow drifted relentlessly against walls, piling high enough to obscure doors and windows. Only the strongest structures, carefully built from timber, stone, and turf, resisted the pressure. Within these homes, life continued at a deliberate pace, dictated by the need to conserve warmth and maintain essential routines. Cooking fires burned steadily, their smoke curling upward and outward, a faint signal to neighbors that life persisted despite the frost. In the small villages of Scandinavia, longhouses often served multiple families, each contributing labor and resources to maintain the building's integrity. Roofs were reinforced regularly, chimneys inspected, and insulation replenished as needed. Inside, communal hearths were surrounded by benches and sleeping platforms, the warmth radiating outward to every corner. Even simple activities, such as preparing dried fish or kneading bread, were undertaken with awareness of heat conservation. Doors were closed, movement minimized, and the fire tended carefully to prevent fuel waste. Storage was another crucial consideration. Barrels and bins, carefully sealed, protected grains, dried meat, and salted fish from frost and rodents. Herbs and dried vegetables were stored in woven baskets, suspended from rafters to avoid damp floors. In Iceland, where winters could be particularly long, food had to last for months, leaving little room for error. Every meal was rationed, measured, and accounted for, and families developed meticulous routines to rotate supplies and ensure that no portion spoiled before it could be consumed. The placement of livestock also reflected the realities of extreme cold. Animals were kept close to living quarters, sometimes within the same building, their bodies providing supplementary heat. Cattle, goats, and sheep contributed warmth through the slow release of body heat, while smaller creatures such as chickens were housed in adjacent pens insulated against frost. Nomadic communities in Siberia used tents with central hearths, sleeping on layers of furs and hides to trap warmth. These shelters were compact, portable, and highly efficient, demonstrating a profound understanding of thermal management long before the science of insulation existed. Even in remote alpine settlements, houses were designed with both heat retention and practicality in mind. Roofs sloped sharply to shed snow, walls were thick, and windows minimal. Inside, families clustered together on raised platforms, their sleeping areas insulated with straw and furs. Cooking and heating were centralized, and the layout of the house prioritized areas where warmth could be most effectively shared. Outside, snow-packed paths were cleared carefully to maintain access to water sources, stables, and communal spaces. Every decision, from the positioning of a beam to the layering of floor coverings, was a deliberate strategy to survive and thrive in harsh conditions. Firewood was life itself. Families collected and stored months' worth of timber during the fleeting summer. Axes, saws, and sleds became indispensable tools, and the labor of cutting, splitting, and transporting wood was a shared responsibility. Fires were maintained around the clock, providing warmth, light, and the means to cook and dry clothing. Smoke, often viewed as a sign of domestic vitality, also served a subtle signaling function, communicating activity and habitation across the snow-laden landscape. Small innovations reflected centuries of adaptation. Thresholds were raised to prevent snow from drifting inside. Doors were lined with cloth to block cold drafts. Stones were arranged near hearths to radiate warmth long after the fire had dimmed. Beds were raised on platforms, covered with layers of straw, wool, and animal skins, maximizing insulation. Even simple furniture was strategically placed to preserve heat and facilitate daily routines. In these homes, survival depended not only on the structure itself, but on the careful, deliberate actions of the people within. Children played and learned within these winter sanctuaries. They were taught to move carefully over icy floors, help with feeding animals, and carry firewood without wasting precious warmth. Daily life was slow, deliberate, and measured, fostering an intimate understanding of both environment and architecture. Lessons were learned by observation and practice: how to manage a fire, how to layer bedding, how to repair a leaky roof before winter intensified. Every member of the household contributed to a collective effort, each action critical to enduring the long months of cold. Even in the harshest conditions, homes provided not only protection but a sense of continuity and comfort. Inside the thick walls of timber, stone, or turf, families shared meals, stories, and quiet moments of intimacy. Hearths glowed warmly, light reflecting off polished wooden surfaces and layers of furs. In these spaces, the rhythm of life was dictated by the frost outside, but human presence ensured warmth, vitality, and persistence. Homes were not merely shelters, they were carefully crafted instruments of survival, testaments to human ingenuity and resilience in the face of relentless cold. One begins to see the intimate connection between people and their dwellings. Homes were engineered extensions of human endurance, reflecting knowledge accumulated over generations and a profound understanding of the environment. Every wall, roof, hearth, and floor covering was a deliberate response to the cold, a slow, deliberate architecture that allowed medieval communities to endure and thrive where winter's reach was longest and harshest. In the frozen expanses of medieval Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and northern Siberia, survival hinged on mastery of the cold, a mastery expressed as much in the body as in the dwelling. Clothing was not mere decoration or status. It was armor against frostbite, hypothermia, and the slow, insidious wear of months spent in ice-bound landscapes. Each layer, each material, was chosen with purpose, the cumulative effect determining life or death. In this climate, the art of clothing was an intimate blend of craftsmanship, tradition, and necessity. From the moment children were born, they were wrapped in swaddling layers designed for warmth. Furs and wool were preferred for their insulating properties, soft against the skin, yet dense enough to trap heat. As they grew, garments were adapted to each season, with heavier layers in winter and lighter, breathable ones in the brief summer. Hands, feet, and heads were the most vulnerable parts of the body. Mittens and gloves, lined with fur, protected against frostbite, while woolen socks and leather boots shielded feet from the cold ground. Hats, hoods, and scarves ensured that body heat was not lost to the harsh winds that swept across frozen plains and fjords. Every material had significance. Animal hides, often tanned and treated, were durable and warm, forming outer layers that resisted wind and snow. Wool, spun from local sheep, was a staple, layered and woven to create garments that could be tightened or loosened as temperatures shifted. Furs, whether from fox, rabbit, or seal, were prized not only for their warmth, but for their ability to maintain insulation, even when damp from snow or sleet. Families invested considerable effort in producing these garments, using knowledge passed through generations to ensure effectiveness. Garments were layered strategically. The base layer, often linen or fine wool, was soft against the skin and allowed for moisture wicking. Middle layers provided insulation, trapping body heat, while outer layers were robust, windproof, and water-resistant. Cloaks and capes, often fastened at the shoulder or chest, served as additional barriers, their length sometimes reaching ankles to prevent snow from seeping inside. Hoods were pulled tight against wind, and boots laced securely to prevent exposure. Even the smallest gaps could allow cold to penetrate, and survival depended on meticulous attention to these details. In addition to functionality, clothing signaled status and skill. Wealthier households could afford more luxurious furs, intricately woven fabrics, and garments dyed in vibrant colors. Yet even the humblest villagers displayed ingenuity in layering and tailoring, using scraps of material, patched hides, and carefully stitched seams to achieve the same essential warmth. Clothing became a measure of resourcefulness, creativity, and understanding of the environment. Footwear was particularly critical. Snow and ice demanded sturdy boots, lined with furs and often reinforced with leather or wooden soles. Sleds and paths might be slippery or jagged, and the loss of mobility due to frostbitten feet could be catastrophic. Mittens and gloves were similarly essential, often tied to long sleeves to prevent snow from entering. Each garment was a silent, constant companion in the struggle against winter, shaping how people moved, worked, and survived. Handcrafting clothing was laborious and communal. Families worked together to shear wool, tan hides, and sew garments with care. Spinning, weaving, and sewing required skill and patience, particularly when working in the cold months with shortened daylight. Every stitch mattered. Every seam tested the garment's integrity. Defective or thin layers could mean frostbite or worse. Meticulous craftsmanship was a survival strategy as much as an aesthetic choice. Children learned early to respect and maintain their clothing. They were taught to layer effectively, repair tears, and dry garments carefully after exposure to snow or rain. Clothing was treated with care, folded, hung, and maintained as one would tend a precious tool. Parents monitored fit and function, ensuring that children, who were particularly vulnerable to the cold, remained insulated and protected during play, work, or travel. Even the most minor accessories contributed to survival. Belts held layers tightly against the body to trap heat, while scarves could shield the neck and face from piercing wind. Hoods and capes were often reinforced with additional fur along edges to block drafts. In settlements where snow drifted into homes and streets, practical adaptations, like gaiters or leg wraps, became essential. Every element of dress was deliberate, a combination of tradition, observation, and necessity that had evolved over generations to meet the challenge of extreme cold. In the farthest reaches of the medieval north, where the horizon often blurred into a single band of white and sky, clothing was not merely a layer atop the skin, it was a second body. The people who lived here, whether in small Scandinavian farmsteads, isolated Icelandic homesteads, or nomadic encampments of northern Siberia, understood instinctively that the cold was patient. It did not need to strike quickly. It could seep, slip, and sink through the smallest weaknesses in their defenses. Part of surviving, therefore, was learning to anticipate the cold's every intention. Unlike warmer civilizations, where garments changed with fashion, prestige, or royal decree, the clothing of the far north evolved slowly, shaped by climate rather than culture. Each generation refined the techniques of the last, developing a silent language of layers, seams, and materials. A single coat might represent decades of accumulated wisdom knowledge passed from mother to daughter, father to son, master furrier to apprentice. One of the most essential principles was the management of moisture. Sweat and melted snow were as dangerous as the freezing wind. A damp inner layer could sap body heat with ruthless efficiency. Because of this, many communities preferred linen or fine wool as the base layer. The materials were breathable, allowing moisture to escape without clinging to the skin. Hunters, herders, and travelers understood this well. Before any long journey, they inspected not only their cloaks and boots but also their innermost garments, ensuring there were no places where water could linger. Over these base garments came the middle layers, usually thick wool tunics or coats stuffed with additional fibers. Some households developed their own unique techniques, filling garments with down from seabirds or moss collected and dried during the warm months. Moss, surprisingly effective at holding heat, was a secret known especially among northern coastal villages. It was lightweight, naturally absorbent, and could be replaced easily, qualities that made it invaluable during long journeys where every ounce mattered. The outer layers were the true barrier against the elements. These were made from the hides of caribou, reindeer, seal, bear, or even polar fox, depending on the region. Each hide served a different purpose. Sealskin, rich in natural oils, shed water effortlessly. Reindeer fur trapped heat with remarkable efficiency. Bear hides, dense and heavy, were often worn only by the strongest hunters or used as blankets or bedding. A single well-prepared bear hide could keep a family warm in one of the brutal storms that rolled across the northern plains in midwinter. Preparing these hides required immense skill. Tanning was a lengthy process involving soaking, scraping, drying, and softening the hides with oils or animal brains. Families often worked together on these tasks, using tools passed down for generations. Each hide needed to be scraped with care to avoid thinning, and every stitch in the final garment had to be strong enough to resist tearing in the wind or freezing solid after exposure to ice. In some regions, such as Greenland and parts of the Siberian Arctic, sewing materials included sinew fibers taken from the tendons of animals. Sinew thread, when properly prepared, was incredibly strong and resistant to the contraction that occurred in icy conditions. When garments were sewn with sinew and sealed with fish oil or animal fat, they could resist even the harshest sleet and driving winds. Clothing maintenance was an unending task. After every hunt, every expedition, every fishing trip through frozen rivers, garments had to be carefully checked. Snow was brushed off while still dry. Damp edges were hung near the hearth but never so close as to risk scorching. A burned patch in a coat could weaken the entire structure. Families often kept 2 sets of outerwear, rotating them during harsh weather to allow one set to dry completely. In communities where resources were scarce, damaged garments were patched with extraordinary ingenuity. A sleeve might contain 6 or 7 different types of fur, each patch representing a story: an animal hunted, a journey taken, a winter survived. Children's clothing required constant attention. They were more prone to tears and wear from play, and their garments frequently needed resizing as they grew. Parents monitored their layers like guardians hovering over a precious flame. A loose boot could spell frostbite. An exposed wrist could lead to cracked, bleeding skin. Teaching children to dress themselves properly was considered as important as teaching them to hunt, fish, or tend animals. Specialized clothing also emerged depending on a person's role within the community. Hunters wore lighter layers that allowed easier movement, often supplemented by compact capes of fur that could be draped or removed quickly. Fishermen along the coasts used garments lined with seal fat or oil, making them partially waterproof. Women working in freezing streams or snowfields often wore layered skirts with fur-lined leggings underneath, a combination that allowed freedom of movement while retaining warmth. Even spiritual beliefs became intertwined with the world of clothing. Among northern Siberian shamans, ritual garments decorated with animal parts, feathers, or metal ornaments were said to carry the essence of the animals whose hides formed them. These garments were not only symbolic but also practical, serving as protective layers during ceremonies that took place outdoors, often in deep winter. Travel clothing was in a category of its own. Those who crossed long distances, traders, messengers, or hunters tracking migrating animals, wore garments designed for endurance. Their boots were reinforced with additional layers of hide and stuffed with dry grass or moss for insulation. Faces were covered with fur masks or hoods that left only narrow slits for vision. Scarves were wrapped around the neck and lower face, becoming rigid with frost after hours of travel. Some travelers even carried spare mittens inside their coats, tucked close to the body for warmth, ready to replace any pair stiffened by ice. The most experienced travelers knew how to listen to their clothing. A crackling sound in the hide meant it was freezing and needed warmth immediately. A stiff cloak meant the oils were wearing off and would no longer resist moisture. The soft hiss of cold wind slipping through a seam was a warning that the garment needed to be patched before a long journey. Despite the harshness of their environment, these northern peoples found beauty in the clothing they created. Decorations were subtle geometric stitching along a hood, dyed trims on a cloak, or carved bone clasps shaped in the likeness of animals. These details reflected pride in craftsmanship and identity, even in a world where survival left little room for extravagance. To them, beauty did not hinder practicality, it existed within it. Above all, clothing determined how individuals interacted with the frozen world outside their doors. It affected how far they could travel, how long they could work, and how safely they could return home. In a land where winter dominated most of the year, where storms could erase entire landscapes in white, clothing was not simply worn, it was trusted. And that trust, built through generations of hardship and wisdom, became one of the greatest tools the medieval peoples of the far north possessed. In the coldest reaches of the medieval world, food was never a simple matter. It was not something taken for granted or gathered at leisure. Instead, it was a constant pursuit, woven into the rhythm of survival. The frozen lands shaped every choice, every routine, every tradition. Meals were less about flavor and abundance, and more about endurance, preservation, and ingenuity. Human lives bent to the demands of the climate, and the climate, in its relentless severity, shaped their diets in return. For much of the year, the earth was locked beneath snow and ice. Soil hardened, streams slowed into thick, glass-like ribbons, and the forests fell silent except for the occasional movement of hardy wildlife. In regions like Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and the northern tundras of Siberia, the window for fresh harvest was narrow, small, fleeting, almost fragile. Families learned to adapt to these conditions, turning brief summers into seasons of frantic preparation. During the short growing period, villagers worked the land with urgency. Barley, rye, and hardy root vegetables were coaxed from thin soil. Even then, the yield was modest. Crops that in warmer regions might grow tall and wide remained stunted here, forced to compete with rocky ground and unpredictable weather. Children learned early to gather herbs, berries, and edible greens from the sparse landscape, storing them carefully in woven baskets or wooden casks. Nothing that could be eaten was ignored, and very little was wasted. But the heart of survival lay not in fresh harvests, but in preservation. By midsummer, the work had already shifted toward the long winter ahead. Smokehouses came alive, their dark rafters filled with strips of drying meat. Fish cod, salmon, trout were split open, salted, and hung in rows that resembled wind chimes made of pale, glistening flesh. Hunters returned with reindeer, elk, or smaller game, and families worked side by side to prepare the meat for storage. Salt was precious, carried along trade routes from distant places, and used sparingly but strategically. Each grain served a purpose. The cold itself became a tool. In many settlements, ice acted as a natural preservative, long before such methods were understood scientifically. Caves, pits, and stone cellars stayed chilled throughout the year, offering stable environments in which food could rest untouched by decay. Medieval families learned to stack provisions in careful layers, meat wrapped in skins, fish tied with twine, grains sealed in leather bags, ensuring that each part remained protected from moisture and pests. Still, hardship was inevitable. Even with the best preparation, winters often outlasted supplies. People learned to stretch meals, diluting broths, mixing grains with bark flour or ground roots, and rationing dried fish so thinly that each portion seemed hardly more than a taste. Hunger was not an unfamiliar companion. It shadowed the edges of daily life, a quiet reminder of the harshness beyond the door. Meals in these regions were simple but purposeful. A bowl of steaming porridge might provide warmth in the morning, its heat seeping into stiff fingers after a night spent in cold chambers. Dried fish, softened by boiling, could serve as the centerpiece of an evening meal. Meat, when available, was often reserved for special occasions, or for the physically demanding tasks of hunters, woodcutters, or travelers. Fat, the dense, sustaining kind found in seals, whales, or domesticated animals, was especially valued. It provided fuel for the body, helping people endure long stretches of exposure to the cold. Families often gathered close together during meals, not out of ceremony, but because warmth mattered. A cluster of bodies around a hearth made the difference between comfort and discomfort, between eating in relative ease or in the chill that seeped through walls. As bowls were passed and shared, Stories surfaced quiet recollections of previous winters, reminders of hardships overcome. These moments strengthened bonds, reinforcing a sense of community that was essential to survival. Fishing was perhaps the most reliable source of food, especially in Scandinavia and the North Atlantic settlements. Even when ground froze solid and forests yielded little, the sea, cold and ever-moving, continued to give. Men ventured onto icy shores or cut holes through frozen lakes, dropping lines weighted with bone or metal hooks. The work was slow and often dangerous. Winds could shift suddenly, and cold water swallowed those who misjudged their footing. But for many, fishing was the lifeline that carried villages through winter. In coastal regions, larger expeditions ventured into deeper waters when conditions allowed. Longboats and smaller vessels braved frigid waves, bringing back catches that would be salted and stored. The sea, unpredictable as it was, offered a steadiness that the land could not. Its bounty shaped entire communities, determining trade, culture, and seasonal routines. Animal husbandry played a supporting role. Sheep, goats, and cattle were kept in barns, insulated with layers of straw, their breaths forming clouds in the cold air. Milk, when available, was turned into cheese or butter foods that could be stored for long periods. Yet maintaining livestock was a challenge. Feed was scarce, and the animals required constant care to survive bitter winters. Each creature represented a delicate balance between the burden of upkeep and the promise of nourishment. Hunting supplemented diets, though success varied with region and season. Reindeer, elk, boar, and smaller game offered valuable protein and fat. Hunters tracked animals through forests, across plains, and into valleys where snowfall drifted into soft, deceptive piles. Tracks, scat, and subtle markings in the snow became guides. A successful hunt meant more than meat. Hides provided clothing, bones became tools, and fat was rendered for lamps or cooking. Nothing was left unused, for in these lands, waste was not an option. When scarcity reached its height, ingenuity surfaced in unexpected ways. People ground dried fish skins into powder to thicken broths. Mosses and lichens, once softened by boiling, could supplement meals. In some communities, fermented foods buried in pits or sealed in barrels offered vital nutrients during the bleakest stretches. What might seem unpalatable by modern standards was, to those medieval families, a lifeline crafted from necessity and centuries of adaptation. Despite all hardships, there was a quiet beauty in the way people approached food. Meals were humble, yet deeply connected to the rhythms of the land. Food was a reflection of patience, endurance, and reverence for nature's unpredictability. It required care to gather, wisdom to preserve, and discipline to manage. And in return, it offered the sustenance that allowed communities to survive winters that stretched endlessly across the horizon. Even in scarcity, flavors existed subtle, earthy, smoky, or salty. Not indulgent, but grounding. The kind of flavors that carried stories of long summers, hard labor, and family traditions. The kind that reminded people of their place in the cycle of frost, thaw, and frost again. And so, through each season, medieval families learned not just to survive the cold, but to work with it, shaping their diets to match its demands. For in the coldest parts of the world, food was never truly about abundance. It was about understanding the land, respecting its limits, and gathering just enough warmth and energy to continue the long walk through winter. If food gathering and preservation formed the backbone of survival in the coldest regions of the medieval world, then cooking itself became the gentle heart that warmed homes and brought life to the center of every long winter night. Across Scandinavia, Iceland, the Arctic fringes of Russia, and the windswept Norse colonies of Greenland, cooking was not simply a matter of preparing meals. It was an act of comfort, a method of creating warmth, and a ritual woven into the daily rhythm of existence. In these frozen lands, kitchens were rarely separate rooms. Instead, cooking took place around the hearth, an open flame set in the middle of a longhouse or cabin. Or in more northern settlements, a recessed fire pit cleverly designed to conserve heat. Smoke curled upward into the rafters or drifted through small vents carved into the walls. Every meal began with the steady crackling of wood or peat. Families relied on whatever they could burn: driftwood collected from rocky shorelines, branches stripped from stunted forests, or blocks of dried animal dung, which surprised medieval travelers with their warmth and longevity. The cooking tools were simple but incredibly durable. Iron cauldrons, solid enough to withstand decades of use, hung from hooks above the fire. Clay pots, warmed slowly to avoid cracking, simmered gently in the coals. Wooden ladles, carved from birch or pine, stirred thick porridges and broths. Knives, always sharp, always necessary, served as both utensil and essential survival tool. Platters and bowls were made from wood or horn, polished smooth from years of handling. But the culinary creativity of these medieval communities expressed itself not in elaborate dishes, but in the subtle ways they transformed the little they had. The cold shaped everything. Ingredients thawed slowly, cooking time stretched longer, and meals often required careful planning, as frozen meat or fish could take hours to soften enough to cut or cook. The harsh climate forced cooks to consider heat itself as a precious resource. Fires were not left roaring unless absolutely necessary, and meals were designed to cook slowly while conserving fuel. In winter, the most common dish was a kind of stew or porridge, something that could simmer for hours with minimal supervision. These thick mixtures combined grains like barley or rye with dried fish, bits of meat, rendered fat, herbs gathered during summer, and sometimes whatever roots remained in storage. The flavors were earthy, smoky, salty in places, but comforting in their simplicity. Importantly, these stews could be reheated again and again. A pot might last several days, and every reheating added new ingredients and layers of taste. Meat was rarely roasted openly unless there was a celebration or a large feast. Roasting required too much fuel and was difficult to control in drafty longhouses. Instead, most meat was boiled, a method that preserved not only the flesh but the valuable fat that floated to the surface. Families skimmed this fat carefully, storing it in wooden containers to use in lamps, pastries, or medicinal salves. On the coldest days, a spoonful of fat dissolved in broth could mean the difference between strength and exhaustion. The Cold World gave birth to unique methods of cooking, many of them unexpected to modern eyes. In northern Siberia, hunters sometimes cooked fish by burying it beneath heated stones, or in shallow pits that held warmth remarkably well. Inuit communities in the medieval Arctic blubber-rich regions could cook with raw fat using seal oil as both fuel and food. In Scandinavia, families placed wooden boards near the hearth to warm bread dough slowly. The rising, a patient act that defied the winter air. Even in Iceland, where volcanic heat created pockets of warm earth, people steamed food using geothermal vents, an early, natural form of slow cooking that left dishes infused with mineral-rich aromas. When ingredients were scarce, seasoning became precious. Salt was treasured, and many medieval households used it sparingly, reserving it mainly for preservation. Herbs such as juniper, angelica, and thyme added brief bursts of aroma. Smoke itself became a key flavoring agent, embedding every meal with notes of the woods used in the fire. Even the containers, wooden bowls, or clay pots, contributed subtle tastes over time. The concept of flavor in these frozen lands was not about indulgence, but identity. It carried the scent of a family's preservation methods, the memory of last summer's harvest, the promise that traditions, however small, could endure beyond the ice. Yet, despite the simplicity of ingredients, meals carried a sense of ceremony. The act of eating was deeply communal. In longhouses, families gathered close, their bodies angled toward the hearth. The dim firelight cast shadows on the walls as steam rose from shared bowls. Children sat nearest to the warmth, their cheeks flushed. Elders underscored each meal with quiet stories, tales of ancestors who weathered storms, of years when the sea froze early, of hunts that turned perilous but ended in triumph. In many homes, The eldest woman controlled the cooking fire, a responsibility passed through generations. Her experience shaped not only the food itself, but the household's entire rhythm of survival. She knew how much grain remained, how many preserved fish could be eaten each week, when to ration the fattest cuts, and when to stretch meals thinner. Her judgment could mean comfort, hardship, or, in the worst winters, survival. Utensils and table customs varied between cultures, but the core remained. Food was shared, never hoarded. Even in scarcity, generosity was expected. Guests were offered seats near the hearth, and a ladle of stew was extended without hesitation. To refuse hospitality was considered unthinkable, for winter could humble anyone. A traveler today might find such traditions symbolic, but to medieval communities in the frozen north, hospitality was literally a life-saving institution. In celebrations, rare but fiercely cherished meals transformed from necessity into joy. Weddings, the birth of a child, successful hunts, seasonal festivals marking the return of sunlight each brought moments of abundance. Fatty cuts of meat were roasted over open flames. Fish was grilled instead of boiled. Bread was baked with precious honey or berries saved since summer. Songs echoed through longhouses, and the warmth of bodies and fire blended until the cold outside felt distant, almost irrelevant. These moments nourished more than the body. They fed the spirit. Even drinking had its rituals. Fermented beverages, weak ales, berry wines, meads diluted with meltwater brought a sense of comfort. Alcohol kept people warm only in sensation, not in truth, but the psychological warmth mattered. It softened conversations, encouraged laughter, and helped families forget just for a moment the icy stillness pressing against the walls. As the medieval world slowly evolved, trade routes introduced new spices and ingredients. A pinch of imported pepper or cinnamon might travel thousands of miles before reaching a cold village, instantly transforming a humble meal into a treasured novelty. These tastes were rare luxuries, often reserved for chieftains, wealthy merchants, or religious leaders. Yet even the smallest hint of foreign flavor could spark wonder. And yet, even as the world connected, the cold lands remained rooted in their traditions. Their culinary culture was never one of extravagance. It was a culture of endurance, patience, resourcefulness, a culture where every meal reflected the environment. Stark but sustaining, simple but meaningful, quiet yet profound. Cooking was not just a domestic task. It was a dialogue with winter itself. Every fire lit, every pot stirred, every broth ladled into a bowl was an act of defiance against the cold. And every shared meal was a reminder that even in the harshest climates, warmth could be created, sustained, and passed from hand to hand. In the frozen reaches of the medieval North, life was measured not in hours or days, but in the quiet endurance required to survive the biting cold. The rhythm of daily life was dictated by temperature, daylight, and the subtle shifts in weather. Every movement, every laborious step across frozen ground carried consequence. In villages perched along fjords, rivers, or tundra plains, survival demanded a delicate balance of energy, skill, and patience. A dance with an environment that refused to yield. Morning began quietly, often before the sun crested the horizon. In longhouses or stone cottages, families stirred beneath layers of furs and blankets. Breath rose in delicate clouds, mingling with smoke from embers carefully banked from the previous evening. The cold outside pressed against walls, seeping into corners and under doors. Children huddled close to parents. Animals crowded into stalls, sharing the warmth of bodies. Every life, human and beast, was linked in a common struggle against the relentless chill. The first tasks of the day were practical and immediate. Fires were stoked, hearths cleared of ash, and water carefully melted from ice or snow. Food from yesterday's preservation, steamed porridge, dried fish, or salted meat, was prepared with care, its warmth vital not only for sustenance but to drive heat through stiffened limbs. Clothing, carefully layered, was inspected for wear, repaired if frayed. Even the act of dressing became a ritual. each layer meticulously applied to preserve precious body heat. Once the household was prepared, work began. Men often ventured into forests, plains, or frozen rivers to perform essential tasks: chopping wood, tending livestock, hunting, or fishing. Axes struck trees with steady rhythm, splitting wood that would fuel the hearth for days. The forest, silent except for the echoing thud of chopping or the occasional call of a distant bird, became both a provider and a hazard. Snow concealed uneven ground, hidden ice, or predators, making every step an act of cautious calculation. Hands, clad in fur-lined gloves, became raw from labor, faces reddened and cracked from wind. Fishing remained a central occupation, as it had been for generations. When rivers and lakes froze, men cut precise holes in the ice, threading lines weighted with hooks through the thin, brittle surface. Patience was essential. A catch might take hours, yet each fish could sustain a family for days. In coastal settlements, the work was even more perilous. Small boats braved frigid waters, where waves, wind, and freezing spray tested skill and courage. Nets were dragged, lines checked, and the catch immediately salted or hung to dry. A single misstep, a broken net, a sudden storm could mean the loss of weeks of preparation. Women managed households with equal intensity. Their labor extended beyond cooking and care of children. It encompassed the preservation of food, maintenance of clothing, preparation of hides, and tending of smaller animals. Each act was intertwined with survival. They checked grain stores, mended torn furs, churned butter, or tended slow fires to keep rooms warm. Water had to be carried from wells or melted from ice, often in heavy wooden buckets. Even the simple act of sweeping floors became a physical challenge. As snow or frost drifted indoors, children were integrated into this rhythm from an early age. Boys learned to track animals, handle tools, and assist with sleds or carrying firewood. Girls learned to spin, weave, mend, and cook, often shadowing their mothers through long hours of repetitive but vital tasks. Play existed only when work was complete or in moments of calm. Yet even these activities reinforced practical skills: balancing on icy roofs, sliding on frozen streams, or carrying small bundles of kindling. Every motion, even leisure, had purpose. Herding and tending livestock took on particular significance in winter. Sheep, goats, and cattle were kept in barns designed to conserve heat, but even with straw and insulation, the cold penetrated. Farmers carried hay, supplemented water with melted snow, and checked animals regularly to prevent frostbite or illness. The animal's survival was inseparable from human endurance. A sick or frozen creature meant less food, less fat, and reduced warmth for the household. Travel, even for short distances, was laborious and dangerous. Snowdrifts obscured paths, rivers froze unevenly, and ice concealed sharp rocks or holes. Villagers relied on sleds pulled by animals or themselves, carrying firewood, supplies, or harvested foods. Every journey demanded skill, knowledge of the terrain, and respect for the weather's subtle warnings. A sudden drop in temperature or an unexpected storm could turn a routine walk into a perilous ordeal. Daily work was punctuated by quiet observation of the natural world. Medieval people in these regions became acute students of wind patterns, ice formation, and animal behavior. A shift in the flight of birds, a crackling sound in the ice, or the smell of approaching thaw could determine whether a hunt succeeded or a journey was safe. Knowledge passed through generations was as vital as any tool. Intuition and experience were survival instruments in themselves. Even when performing mundane chores, people moved with a deliberate awareness of energy conservation. Work was often segmented, with bursts of effort interspersed with brief rest by the hearth. Frostbite, exhaustion, or hunger could prove fatal. Tools were maintained with care, clothing adjusted frequently, and small acts, such as rubbing hands or moving slowly to warm joints, could determine whether one endured the day or suffered lasting harm. Life in these frozen regions was both physically punishing and mentally exacting. Despite these hardships, there was rhythm and continuity. Work was punctuated by communal meals, quiet storytelling, and shared labor. Families relied on mutual support. Neighbors assisted in hunts, wood collection, or repair of homes damaged by ice and wind. Rituals, small, almost imperceptible, organized the day. Lighting the hearth at dawn, checking the livestock at mid-morning, gathering water before dusk. Even silence became purposeful, as the wind outside carried both cold and danger. Yet, in the midst of the struggle, there were moments of unexpected beauty. Frost etched intricate patterns on windows and doors, turning simple dwellings into ephemeral works of art. Animals moved gracefully across snow, their tracks tracing stories of life and survival. Children discovered fleeting joy in snowdrifts, sledding along icy slopes, or sliding across frozen ponds. Every day was framed by contrast: the harshness of the cold, the necessity of labor, and the gentle warmth created by fire, family, and shared effort. The endurance required of daily life instilled resilience, patience, and ingenuity. Medieval northern communities survived not through abundance, but through mastery of the environment, careful attention to detail, and respect for the slow, exacting rhythms of nature. In every swing of an axe, in every churn of butter, in every step across frost-hardened ground, the cold demanded vigilance, yet rewarded adaptation and creativity. And so, as the sun rose and fell in fleeting arcs across the winter sky, life continued unceasing, deliberate, and quietly heroic. Work and survival in these lands were inseparable. The cold was both adversary and teacher. Each day, each laborious act shaped the bodies, minds, and spirits of those who inhabited the frozen edges of the medieval world. As the day progressed, the interplay between human effort and the relentless cold became more apparent. Work in the frozen medieval north was rarely isolated. Each task depended upon preparation, timing, and coordination with others. Communities had learned over generations that survival demanded cooperation. A hunter tracking reindeer could not risk venturing too far alone. Families in isolated valleys relied on neighbors to help chop wood, repair roofs, or carry heavy stores of grain. Social bonds were inseparable from survival, and winter work became a choreography of collective endurance. Hunting, one of the most vital occupations, was a constant negotiation with the environment. Predators were not limited to wolves or bears. Frost, snowdrifts, and treacherous ice were as deadly as any animal. Hunters tracked footprints across blinding white landscapes, interpreting subtle depressions, broken branches, or the patterns of snow on hillsides. Movement was deliberate, calculated, and often slow, each step taken to conserve energy while remaining alert to danger. A misjudged leap across an ice-covered stream could result in injury, hypothermia, or worse. Every successful hunt carried immediate reward: meat, fat, hide, and bone. But the cost of failure was visible in empty stomachs, thinner fur, and increased reliance on scarce provisions. Fishing mirrored hunting in its demand for patience and precision. In rivers that froze solid, men cut holes in ice so thick that axes or chisels labored against it for hours. Once through, lines and nets were dropped carefully into frigid water, hands gloved in layers of fur and wool. Waiting became a practice in endurance. The slightest miscalculation could cost the line or hook. In coastal areas, winter storms often curtailed maritime expeditions, forcing reliance on local ponds, inlets, or ice fishing. Even then, the work was communal. Men and boys shared tasks, passing lines, checking traps, and stacking catches for smoking or salting. The rhythm of these labors, long stretches of stillness punctuated by brief bursts of action, was mirrored in the slow, meditative cadence of survival itself. Inside dwellings, daily work continued with equal intensity, though its pace and focus differed. Women prepared and preserved food, ensuring that every morsel was utilized. Bones were boiled for stock, fat rendered for lamps, and skins treated for warmth. Milk was churned into butter, and grains were ground carefully, each meal a product of labor, care, and foresight. Furs and garments were mended. Patches were sewn with precision to avoid drafts or exposed seams. Every household act, however small, contributed to the family's endurance. Even tending the fire was a careful art. Too little, and the house remained cold. Too much, and precious fuel was wasted. The heat had to be managed with foresight, understanding the ways in which a hearth could warm a room for hours with minimal input. Children's labor was integrated into these routines, and their tasks, though age-appropriate, were essential. Small hands carried firewood, tended chickens, or assisted with mending garments. Girls learned the intricacies of spinning wool, weaving blankets, and layering furs for optimal warmth. Boys learned to track animals, help with ice fishing, or carry bundles of supplies across frozen terrain. Education in these regions was practical. Lessons in endurance, observation, and skill were as valuable as reading or religion. In every chore, children absorbed knowledge about the environment, about work, and about the interdependence of community. The architecture of survival shaped work patterns as well. Longhouses, stone cottages, and insulated barns required ongoing maintenance. Roofs were cleared of heavy snow to prevent collapse. Walls were sealed with mud or moss to block drafts. Chimneys were cleaned so fires burned efficiently. Every household tool, from axes to wooden sleds, was inspected daily, repaired, and preserved. Tools were often shared, and community work parties emerged organically during the harshest months. Labor was intertwined with social cohesion. Neighbors assisted each other in lifting heavy logs, reinforcing walls, or constructing temporary shelters in the event of storms. Weather dictated flexibility in the daily schedule. Clear, calm mornings were seized for outdoor labor, firewood gathering, hunting, or tending livestock. Snowstorms or sudden blizzards forced withdrawal into sheltered spaces, where indoor work, food preparation, repair, or textile production became the priority. Even small shifts in temperature or wind direction were noted meticulously. An unexpected thaw could turn pathways treacherous, ice unstable, and hunting routes impassable. Medieval northern communities developed a form of intuitive meteorology. Observations of clouds, wind, and animal behavior were recorded mentally and passed through generations. Knowledge of the land, in essence, was a matter of survival. Despite the unrelenting physical demands, rhythm and routine provided structure and solace. Work punctuated by shared meals or the crackle of a hearth offered a semblance of comfort. Families and neighbors shared tasks and time in communal spaces, sometimes around fires or within barns. In these moments, stories, songs, and traditions were exchanged. Tales of previous winters, of hunting feats, or of narrow escapes from storms became embedded in collective memory. Labor was thus intertwined with culture. Even the harshest work contained threads of narrative, of continuity, and of quiet celebration. Winter rituals, both practical and spiritual, infused daily work with purpose. Before a journey across frozen rivers, a small blessing might be uttered. Before slaughtering livestock, rituals acknowledged respect for life. These customs were not mere superstition. They reinforced mindfulness and encouraged careful attention to detail, qualities essential for survival. In a frozen landscape, a lapse of concentration could have immediate and dire consequences, and cultural practice reinforced safety and awareness. Physical endurance was not the sole challenge. Mental resilience was equally vital. Long days in snow and darkness tested patience and focus. Repetitive tasks, harsh conditions, and scarcity demanded an acceptance of the environment's strictures. Yet, people adapted, finding rhythm in repetition and satisfaction in competence. Mastery of tools, animals, and materials became a source of pride. Children, too, gained confidence in their abilities, learning that their actions, however small, contributed meaningfully to the family's survival. As daylight waned, preparation for nightfall became urgent. Fires were carefully banked, animals secured, and food stored safely from cold and potential predators. Clothing layers were inspected and adjusted. Children were gathered close to share warmth, and elderly members were tended with vigilance. Sleep, though short in some seasons, was structured around warmth and shelter. Each day ended with the quiet awareness that the next would demand equal diligence, patience, and skill. The cold was ever present, shaping body, mind, and action. Even in these extreme conditions, moments of beauty persisted. Frost patterns on windows, the sound of wind over ice, or the ethereal glow of sunlight reflecting off snow provided quiet wonder. Tasks, though laborious, often brought satisfaction. The completion of a repaired roof, a successful hunt, or a well-stacked woodpile was both practical achievement and moral reassurance. Medieval northern communities understood that the frozen landscape, though harsh and unyielding, also offered rhythm, perspective, and enduring lessons in patience and resilience. Work and daily life in the coldest regions of the medieval world were inseparable from the environment itself. Survival required constant adaptation, meticulous attention, communal cooperation, and mental and physical endurance. Every swing of the axe, every step across frozen ground, every chore tended to the smallest detail, carried significance beyond the immediate task. In these northern landscapes, life was hard, yet the people's skill, patience, and quiet ingenuity created continuity, warmth, and meaning amid the frost and snow. And so, as twilight settled across frozen plains and fjords, communities retreated into their homes. Fires glowed in stone hearths, animals huddled in straw-lined stalls, and families shared the comfort that labor, foresight, and mutual care had secured. Life in the coldest regions of the medieval world was, above all, a daily negotiation with nature, a delicate, measured, and persistent engagement that defined body, spirit, and society. In the frozen north, winter was more than a season. It was a force that dictated life, labor, and survival. Yet, even amid relentless cold, human communities sought warmth, not only from hearths and clothing, but from culture, ritual, and shared experience. Winter festivals and traditions were the heartbeats of medieval northern life, moments when hardship and monotony gave way to celebration, storytelling, and collective memory. These events provided rhythm to the otherwise long, stark months and offered a bridge between necessity and joy. The preparation for winter festivals began long before snow fully settled on the land. In small villages of Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland, families harvested and preserved not only food, but materials for ceremonial use. Berries, grains, and salted fish were stored for feast days. Evergreens were collected from forests, pine, spruce, or fir, to decorate homes and meeting halls. Woven mats and tapestries were hung to create warmth and beauty, softening the stark interiors of wooden or stone structures. Even the simplest of dwellings became transformed, illuminated by the flicker of multiple hearths, adorned with natural elements that reminded people of life beyond the ice. Feasts were central to the celebration. While food remained modest compared to southern Europe, what was prepared carried both nourishment and symbolic meaning. Porridge could be sweetened with preserved berries. Salted meats were carefully roasted or boiled. Fish, smoked and dried, became part of ceremonial dishes. Spices, rare and costly, were added sparingly to mark special occasions. Ale and mead were brewed not only for warmth, but for social cohesion. Sharing a drink became an act of communion, reinforcing ties between neighbors, kin, and allies. The table itself, though humble, was a microcosm of the community, a place where status, skill, and generosity were observed and honored. Music, singing, and storytelling accompanied these gatherings. Songs were passed down orally, recounting legends of heroic hunters, winter spirits, and the endurance of forebears. Drums, flutes, and stringed instruments crafted from local wood and bone provided rhythm for dances that often lasted late into the long nights. Storytelling was equally vital, carrying lessons, warnings, and cultural memory. Tales of blizzards survived, of villages saved by cleverness, of hunters who braved wolves and ice, served to entertain, instruct, and reinforce the community's collective identity. Children sat wide-eyed, absorbing stories that intertwined the natural and supernatural, the practical and the imaginative. Religious observance interwove seamlessly with celebration. In Christianized regions of Northern Europe, saints' feast days and winter solstice ceremonies merged, blending pre-Christian customs with ecclesiastical rituals. Candles, blessed by priests, illuminated homes and halls, symbolizing hope and light in the darkest months. Families observed prayers before meals, rituals to bless livestock, and offerings to ensure health and bounty in the coming seasons. Even small gestures, hanging protective charms, lighting a candle in a window, reflected a profound understanding of vulnerability and dependence on forces both natural and divine. Games and competitions were a common part of festival life. Sled races down snow-covered hills, mock hunts, and skill contests tested agility, strength, and endurance. Such activities were not mere amusement. They were practical, maintaining sharpness in both body and mind during the long, idle stretches of winter. Communities took pride in champions, hunters, skaters, or archers whose prowess in cold conditions elevated them to local fame. These competitions also reinforced social bonds, teaching cooperation, fair play, and the importance of collective morale in harsh environments. Winter festivals were often linked to survival skills, with implicit lessons embedded in each custom. Ice cutting for water storage, firewood stacking contests, or shared hunts demonstrated practical knowledge through communal activity. Younger members of the community learned the rhythm of labor disguised as play, absorbing techniques that would later be essential to survival. Older generations taught patience, observation, and respect for nature through games, storytelling, and ritual, ensuring that the wisdom accumulated over decades would not be lost. Communal structures like longhouses, barns, and village halls became centers of activity. Inside these spaces, the architecture and fire placement were critical. The hearth warmed bodies, dried clothing, and created a safe gathering space, while the walls and roofs, reinforced with moss, straw, or timber, retained heat and kept out drafts. Even the arrangement of people around the fire reflected hierarchy, and custom elders, hunters, and village leaders often held central positions, while younger members occupied peripheral spots, learning through observation. These arrangements mirrored the balance of practical necessity, social cohesion, and ceremonial decorum. The sensory experience of winter festivals was striking. The smell of smoked fish mingled with pine and hearth smoke. Woolen garments brushed against skin, and the sound of wind whistling through gaps in the roof contrasted with laughter, songs, and the rhythmic tap of musical instruments. Taste, warmth, and touch were all heightened by the surrounding cold. Each sensory element reinforced the significance of the occasion, turning otherwise ordinary food, clothing, and space into a tapestry of ritual, culture, and shared endurance. Despite the chill, winter festivals were inherently slow, reflective, and meditative. They offered pause in a life dominated by survival. Days could be long, repetitive, and physically demanding. Yet the ceremonies, storytelling, and communal activities created rhythm and meaning. Participants became acutely aware of the environment's influence, celebrating not in defiance of cold, but in dialogue with it. The harsh landscape framed each moment, lending weight and clarity to joy, reflection, and gratitude. In some regions, festivals extended into symbolic acts of endurance, overnight vigils by the fire, long processions through snow, or ritualized hunts tested both physical and mental resilience. These acts were celebrated as feats of communal strength and personal fortitude, emphasizing values crucial to life in extreme condition. They also provided a shared narrative. Each participant became a living example of the human capacity to withstand, adapt, and thrive despite environmental adversity. In the darkest months, when daylight was scarce and snow blanketed the land for weeks, winter festivals marked temporal milestones. They broke the monotony of long nights, created markers in time, and reminded communities of cycles beyond their immediate perception. The changing of the moon, the position of the sun, and the arrival of specific seasonal events were woven into these celebrations, connecting people to nature and to history. Festivals became living calendars, shaping communal rhythm, seasonal labor, and cultural memory. Through these shared experiences, medieval northern communities cultivated a profound sense of belonging and continuity. The festivals reinforced identity, established norms, and transmitted practical and moral knowledge across generations. In the coldest regions of the medieval world, survival was intertwined with ritual, and endurance was inseparable from culture. Winter festivals and traditions were not mere entertainment, they were essential threads in the fabric of life, sustaining body, mind, and community through months of isolation and frost. As winter deepened, festivals took on even greater significance, transforming the bleak landscape into a space of warmth, movement, and ritual. Among the scattered settlements of medieval Scandinavia and the North Atlantic, gatherings became both practical and symbolic, merging survival with culture. In these northern communities, the rhythm of festivals was dictated not by clocks or calendars alone, but by the shifting ice, the migration of animals, and the subtle changes in daylight. The timing of feasts, vigils, and games was intertwined with the natural world, reminding all participants that life was a negotiation with forces larger than themselves. One of the most widely observed celebrations was the Yule Festival, a remnant of pre-Christian traditions that had intertwined with Christian observances over centuries. Yule was marked by feasting, storytelling, and ceremonial fires designed to summon light into the darkest days. In the longhouses of Norway and Iceland, villagers gathered around massive hearths, flames crackling, shadows dancing against timbered walls. Logs, carefully split and stacked over months, fed these fires, providing not only warmth but a visual rhythm, a pulse of life in the frozen night. The Yule fire was more than illumination. It was a symbol of hope, endurance, and the promise of return, echoing the cyclical nature of life in extreme cold. Food for Yule was meticulously prepared. Special dishes combined preservation techniques with symbolic ingredients. Spiced meats, slow roasted over embers, were complemented by sweetened grain puddings, nuts, and dried fruits, the latter often imported through trade and treasured for their rarity. Ale and mead flowed steadily, both for warmth and for marking the ceremonial moment, reminding all that celebration was inseparable from sustenance. Even the smallest child understood that these meals were tokens of preparation, patience, and accumulated labor, a direct reflection of human ingenuity against the unforgiving winter. Music and dancing remained central. Flutes carved from bone and horns from reindeer were played alongside simple stringed instruments. Villagers circled the hearth, moving in slow, deliberate patterns, teaching younger members rhythm, coordination, and social cohesion. Songs recounted legendary hunts, heroic ancestors, and mythic beings of ice and snow. These narratives, embedded in melody, conveyed both practical lessons tracking animals, surviving blizzards, or understanding wind patterns, and moral guidance, reinforcing communal values such as bravery, generosity, and ingenuity. Rituals extended beyond the longhouse. Some villages performed outdoor ceremonies, carefully timed with the lunar calendar. Processions through the snow, carrying candles or evergreens, symbolized the persistence of life amid decay. Participants sang, chanted, or remained silent in contemplative walks, connecting with the frozen landscape around them. These rituals fostered awareness of the environment, teaching respect for wind, ice, and snow, and reinforcing that survival demanded harmony with, rather than dominance over, nature. Gift-giving emerged as another enduring practice. While not extravagant, small tokens were exchanged: carved wooden charms, preserved foods, or hand-stitched garments. These gestures strengthened social bonds and reminded communities that even in scarcity, cooperation, and mutual support were essential. Children learned the significance of generosity and reciprocity early, as the survival of one often depended upon the diligence and care of others. Games of endurance and skill complemented rituals. Ice skating races, log sled competitions, and mock hunts served both entertainment and instruction. Participants learned to navigate treacherous surfaces, sharpen reflexes, and endure cold without complaint. Competitions reinforced social hierarchies subtly, rewarding skill, agility, and courage, yet also provided equal opportunity for communal recognition. Winners and losers alike understood the deeper lesson. Mastery of one's body and environment was essential for the months that stretched before them, cold and unforgiving. Storytelling, the quiet heart of winter festivals, reached its peak during the long nights. Elders recounted tales that spanned generations, blending myth with memory. Stories of ice giants, spirits of the tundra, and heroic hunters were interwoven with practical guidance. How to recognize thin ice, track prey, or detect the first signs of frostbite. Children absorbed these lessons passively, but the impact endured, embedding survival strategies within the cultural imagination. Storytelling also offered emotional relief, transforming fear of the unknown into fascination and understanding. Religious observance was ever present. In Christianized regions, priests blessed fires, livestock, and crops, while families made small offerings for protection and prosperity. In some communities, sacred songs and prayers were performed at the threshold between old and new, ensuring that ancestral wisdom and divine favor guided the people through harsh months. These rituals created structure and reassurance, reminding individuals that even in isolation, they were part of a larger continuum of family, community, and history. Finally, winter festivals emphasized resilience. They were not mere indulgence. They were rehearsals for survival, reinforcing endurance, resourcefulness, and the ability to find joy and meaning under severe conditions. Celebrations reminded villagers of what they had accomplished and what they must sustain. The combination of feasting, music, ritual, storytelling, and games created a rhythm that carried people through the cold, dark months, giving them not only practical tools, but a sense of purpose and cohesion. Through these winter festivals and traditions, communities maintained identity, continuity, and hope. In the coldest regions of the medieval world, where survival demanded every ounce of effort, the human spirit found expression not just in labor, but in culture. The firelit halls, snow-crusted processions, and melodies of song offered warmth that no hearth alone could provide. They were evidence that even in the harshest conditions, medieval northern societies had cultivated spaces of joy, reflection, and shared humanity rituals that preserved not only bodies, but hearts and minds across the unforgiving winters of history. In the frozen northern reaches, movement itself was a calculated endeavor. Travel was not undertaken lightly. Every journey demanded careful preparation, an intimate knowledge of terrain, and respect for the whims of weather. Roads, if they could be called that, were often hidden beneath deep snow, ice, or jagged terrain, and the shortest distance between 2 points could become a treacherous passage. Villagers, merchants, and messengers relied on a combination of skill, endurance, and instinct, moving along established trails or natural features that survived the relentless freeze. Horseback riding was rare in the coldest regions during the dead of winter. Instead, sleds drawn by reindeer, oxen, or sturdy dogs became the primary mode of transport. Sled runners carved the snow with rhythm, gliding over frozen rivers and snow-packed plains. Travelers wrapped themselves in layers of furs and wool, their faces shielded by scarves and hoods, eyes narrowed against the reflection of sunlight off ice. Each mile traveled required attention. One misstep could mean breaking through thin ice, or sinking into a snowdrift that could delay or end the journey. Isolation shaped not just movement, but communication. Villages were separated by miles of wilderness, and months could pass without direct contact with neighboring settlements. Letters, when delivered, were carried by messengers who risked frostbite, blizzards, and predatory animals to maintain connections. Often, travelers moved in groups for safety, creating small caravans of sleds and men that relied on shared knowledge and mutual vigilance. The social bonds formed along these journeys were as vital as the goods carried. They were the lifeline for communities scattered across the frozen north. Trade, though limited, was essential. In a land where resources were sparse, communities specialized in particular goods. Salted fish from coastal villages, furs from inland hunters, iron tools or crafted items from alpine settlements. Exchange was less a matter of profit and more of survival. Traders navigated frozen rivers, rocky passes, and icy shores to bring goods that could sustain life through long winters. Salt, an essential preservative, traveled farther than many imagined. Carried from southern ports along perilous routes, treasured in every northern household for its ability to extend the shelf life of meat and fish. The rhythm of trade was dictated by climate. Spring and early summer were the busiest months, when rivers thawed and snow melted from lower passes. Traders seized narrow windows to deliver supplies before winter returned. Delays could be catastrophic. A late shipment of grain, wood, or salt might leave a village vulnerable for months. People relied on detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns, watching the ice and listening to elders who read the land as a guide. Timing, precision, and respect for natural cycles were as critical as the goods themselves. Isolation also shaped governance and social structure. Remote settlements operated with a high degree of self-reliance. Leaders, often chosen for experience or wisdom, managed resources, oversaw hunting and fishing quotas, and resolved disputes. Laws were practical, centered on survival and cooperation, ensuring that the community remained functional even when separated from larger political centers. When messengers arrived with news from distant courts or kingdoms, the information carried weight. It shaped planning, strategy, and alliances. Yet the daily reality was local, intimate, and governed by the constraints of ice, wind, and terrain. Journeys across frozen landscapes demanded ingenuity. Travelers improvised with what the environment provided. Snowshoes woven from wood and hide, sled runners repaired with animal sinew, and food packed to endure without spoiling. Tents and temporary shelters, often constructed from timber or animal hides, provided respite in open terrain. Fires were carefully tended, with smoke directed to reduce scent for hunting, and embers preserved to reignite on subsequent nights. Every action, from preparing provisions to laying out routes, reflected generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving long treks in extreme cold. The sea, for those near the coasts, offered both opportunity and danger. Longboats navigated icy waters when conditions allowed, fishing and trading along fjords and frozen shores. Yet the ocean was unpredictable. Sudden storms could trap vessels in ice, currents shifted under snow, laden skies, and the threat of hypothermia loomed with every exposure. Coastal communities developed precise routines for maritime travel, reading ice patterns, wind shifts, and tidal cues as carefully as one might read a map. The sea itself became a teacher, shaping strategy, timing, and the very rhythm of life. Isolation fostered cultural uniqueness. Communities developed dialects, customs, and techniques suited to their specific environment. Clothing styles, building methods, and hunting practices varied subtly from valley to valley, fjord to fjord. Stories and songs spread slowly, morphing over distances, creating rich, localized oral traditions. When travelers arrived from distant settlements, they brought not only goods, but news, tales, and innovations, seeds of knowledge that often took years to integrate fully. In the frozen north, knowledge itself was a form of currency, traded as carefully as fish, furs, or salted meat. Even the simplest journeys required mental preparation. Travelers rehearsed routes, calculated rations, and anticipated emergencies. Weather forecasts were crude, gleaned from observation rather than instruments, yet deeply trusted. Cloud shapes, wind direction, snow texture, and animal behavior offered hints. Travelers respected omens and the lessons of elders, blending intuition with experience to reduce risk. The margin for error was slim. A misjudged path could leave an entire group stranded, dependent on thin ice, dwindling food stores, and human endurance alone. Thus, in the coldest regions of the medieval world, travel and trade were inseparable from isolation. Each journey was an exercise in planning, resilience, and cooperation. The land demanded respect and observation, while the people relied on shared knowledge and collective effort to survive. The frozen wilderness both challenged and shaped society, dictating where and when communities could thrive and who could endure its trials. Isolation, trade, and travel formed a trinity of survival. Communities depended on each other, even at a distance. Goods sustained bodies and spirits, and knowledge, both practical and cultural, navigated the boundaries between settlements. In a world where frost could claim life as quickly as hunger, movement itself was a statement of courage, adaptability, and human persistence. Each sled journey, river crossing, and trek across snowy plains was a reaffirmation that, even in the harshest conditions, medieval northern societies found ways to connect, exchange, and endure. In the interplay of ice, wind, and distance, these communities demonstrated that survival was more than shelter, clothing, or food. It was a network of relationships, a rhythm of travel, and a careful negotiation with nature itself. And in these patterns, one could glimpse the remarkable adaptability of human beings living at the edge of endurance, living not merely to exist, but to maintain culture, connection, and continuity in a frozen world. As the frozen months deepened, the harsh reality of isolation became increasingly tangible. Villages were not simply separated by distance, but by the very climate itself, a formidable barrier that demanded ingenuity and patience. Trade, though vital, was no simple exchange of goods. It was a carefully choreographed negotiation with nature. Paths were meticulously planned, supplies rationed, and contingencies considered with almost ritual precision. The smallest miscalculation could leave traders stranded, provisions depleted, and lives imperiled in the snowbound wilderness. Caravans, often small in number to remain manageable, moved with deliberate caution. Each member carried a distinct role. One observed the terrain for hazards, another managed provisions, while others attended to the animals and sleds that bore goods. Reindeer, oxen, and dogs were trained to endure extended periods in harsh conditions, their health and stamina carefully monitored. The animals were as integral to survival as the travelers themselves. A weakened animal could halt progress entirely, stranding humans in a merciless expanse of ice and wind. Shelters along the way were rudimentary yet essential. Temporary structures, often fashioned from timber, hides, or snow, provided the most basic protection against blizzards. Fires were tended with painstaking care, embers banked to last through the night and relit in the morning to stave off the creeping frost. Meals were simple, high energy, and compact dried fish, salted meat, and hard bread supplemented with melted snow for water. The focus was on endurance rather than pleasure, sustenance rather than taste. Trade routes were dictated by the rhythms of the environment. Frozen rivers, which could serve as highways in winter, became impassable with the spring thaw, requiring alternate routes through mountain passes or along treacherous coasts. Navigating these paths demanded intimate knowledge, which ice was thick enough to bear weight, where hidden crevices could trap sleds, or which snowdrifts might conceal dangerous slopes. Generations of observation produced maps of memory, mental charts of terrain, wind patterns, and seasonal shifts that were more reliable than parchment or ink. Isolation also shaped innovation. Communities developed methods to maximize trade efficiency and survival. Compact sleds, reinforced with bone or iron, reduced weight while increasing durability. Routes were timed to coincide with predictable weather windows. Trade goods were carefully selected for weight, utility, and value. Salt, furs, iron tools, and preserved food dominated caravans, while local specialties, dried fish, cured meats, or handcrafted items traveled outward in exchange. Each trip was a calculated risk, balancing reward against exposure to wind, ice, and exhaustion. Communication between settlements took on a deliberate, almost ceremonial aspect. Letters and messages, often inscribed on wooden tablets or parchment, were bundled, sealed, and entrusted to travelers whose reliability was as important as speed. Even the act of dispatch carried significance, reflecting trust and the fragility of connection across vast, frozen distances. The arrival of a traveler was more than commerce. It was news, intelligence, and a lifeline rolled into one. The sea, where accessible, offered both opportunity and peril. Coastal communities relied on the waters for trade, fishing, and occasional travel. Yet ice, storms, and shifting currents made navigation treacherous. Longboats and smaller vessels braved narrow fjords and frozen inlets, their crews seasoned and vigilant. Every expedition carried the risk of being trapped by sudden weather changes, of frostbite setting in during delays, or of supplies running out before a safe return. The ocean demanded respect, timing, and local knowledge. Isolation fostered resilience and a culture of preparedness. Villagers developed networks of mutual support, ready to assist travelers or neighboring settlements in need. When a trader became stranded, entire communities might mobilize to provide shelter, food, and guidance. Knowledge of survival techniques, from snowshoe weaving to fire starting and ice assessment, was passed down orally, forming a rich repository of adaptive strategies. In these regions, information was as vital as food or warmth. Despite the dangers, travel and trade also brought moments of connection and culture. Rare festivals, market days, and gatherings allowed villagers from scattered settlements to exchange goods, stories, and news. Songs, legends, and local innovations spread during these encounters, creating bonds across otherwise vast and frozen expanses. These fleeting interactions reinforced identity and survival, reminding isolated communities that they were part of a larger network, even if separated by miles of ice and snow. The mental strain of isolation was as tangible as the physical hardships. Long periods without contact with the outside world fostered introspection, superstition, and creativity. Elders shared survival wisdom through storytelling, recounting both practical lessons and cautionary tales of past travelers. Children absorbed these lessons, learning to anticipate dangers and respect the land. Solitude became a teacher, shaping thought and resilience in ways that the warmth of closer communities could not replicate. Winter, the season of longest isolation, tested every aspect of life. Traders and travelers planned journeys meticulously to avoid the worst months. Yet some risks were unavoidable. Blizzard conditions, whiteouts, and hidden crevices tested even the most experienced. The ability to read subtle signs in snow, ice, and wind often determined success or failure. A seasoned traveler could interpret frozen patterns as warnings, detecting weakness in ice or impending storms before they became apparent to the untrained eye. Yet even in these harsh conditions, human ingenuity shone. Communities devised ingenious ways to manage isolation. Caches of supplies along known routes, signal fires visible across valleys, and winter shelters built into natural terrain for temporary refuge. Tools and techniques evolved in response to necessity. Snowshoes, ice poles, and sled designs improved over generations, and travelers refined clothing and packing methods to withstand prolonged exposure. The frozen north was a harsh teacher, but one whose lessons ensured survival. Through travel and trade, isolation shaped not only survival, but the very culture of these northern settlements. Knowledge, adaptation, and endurance were valued above wealth or luxury. Every journey, whether a routine trade or a perilous expedition, reinforced community bonds, passed down wisdom, and preserved the fragile continuity of life in extreme conditions. In the interplay of ice, snow, and human determination, the medieval North revealed a resilience and creativity that modern observers could scarcely imagine. And so, in the coldest regions of medieval Europe and Siberia, travel, trade, and isolation were not merely practical concerns, they were defining features of life itself. They shaped society, culture, and survival strategies, reflecting the delicate balance between human ambition and the unyielding demands of the natural world. In this frozen expanse, every movement mattered, every interaction was significant, and every step across snow and ice was a testament to endurance, adaptability, and the quiet ingenuity of medieval northern communities. In the northernmost reaches of the medieval world, life was a constant negotiation with the elements. Yet even in this relentless cold, stories emerged, tales of endurance, courage, and ingenuity that passed from one generation to the next. These were not exaggerated sagas, but lived experiences, chronicled in the quiet memory of communities, whispered around fires, and committed to rudimentary records in parchment or wood. Each tale, while unique, shared a common theme: the extraordinary human capacity to endure and adapt in the face of the frozen wilderness. Consider the hunters of Scandinavia, who braved deep snows and piercing winds to track reindeer across vast white expanses. These hunts were far more than a means of procuring food. They were tests of skill, patience, and knowledge of the land. Tracks in snow, subtle disturbances in frozen lakes, and the behavior of wildlife became guides, almost like a silent language. A missed sign could result in a lost hunt, or worse, being caught alone in a blizzard. Successful hunters returned not just with meat and hides, but with stories that were retold and shared, reinforcing the importance of skill, observation, and caution. Travelers, too, faced perilous feats, crossing frozen rivers and mountain passes, often with limited provisions, required careful preparation and almost ritualistic attention to detail. Some journeys extended for weeks, with temperatures dropping low enough to freeze rivers solid and immobilize animals. Yet survival depended on perseverance, clever use of local resources, and an unwavering awareness of one's own limits. The mere act of returning from such journeys intact became a form of legend within villages, a testament to human determination against a world seemingly intent on erasure. In coastal communities, winter storms tested even the most experienced sailors. Longboats braved icy waters, their crews relying on knowledge passed down through generations. Tales of vessels trapped in ice for days, sails frozen stiff, and men working tirelessly to chip away at encroaching frost illustrate the harshness of maritime life. Yet these trials also showcased innovation. Crews used windbreaks, insulated clothing, and clever ice-cutting techniques to survive. Successful voyages became communal triumphs, celebrated quietly yet profoundly in candlelit halls, where the warmth of human presence rivaled the glow of hearth fires. Legends of survival often involved ingenuity under extreme conditions. One account tells of a family stranded in northern Siberia during a sudden blizzard. With supplies running low and frost creeping into their shelter, they constructed a small windbreak using sled frames and animal hides, creating a pocket of warmth that allowed them to endure several nights until relief arrived. Such stories were preserved not merely for their drama, but as practical lessons in resourcefulness. Every action, from layering hides to carefully rationing food, became instruction for the next generation. Children, too, were participants in these feats of survival. From an early age, they learned to respect the severity of their environment. Tasks that might seem trivial in warmer climates, maintaining firewood, checking animals for frostbite, ensuring clothing layers remained dry, became formative experiences. Each completed task was a small victory, building confidence, awareness, and resilience. In the harsh northern winters, the growth of knowledge was inseparable from survival. Some survival stories centered on entire communities, During exceptionally severe winters, entire villages relied on shared labor to maintain pathways, tend livestock, and secure food stores. The snow could reach rooftops, forcing villagers to tunnel between buildings or clear drifted roads to maintain communication and access. In these situations, cooperation was as vital as physical endurance. The act of pulling a sled laden with provisions across deep snow or carrying water over frozen ground became not only a practical task but a testament to human solidarity. Isolation amplified the heroism of survival. When storms trapped travelers between settlements, ingenuity became the difference between life and death. There are records of messengers forging through blizzards, guided by subtle signs in the snow and wind, to deliver critical news or supplies. Others recount hunters building temporary shelters out of ice and brush, enduring the cold until conditions improved. These acts, often mundane in description but monumental in consequence, were elevated to legend over time, forming a body of knowledge interwoven with folklore and local identity. The natural world itself contributed to these stories. Wolves, bears, and other predators prowled the outskirts of human settlements, seeking prey weakened by frost or hunger. Confrontations with wildlife required caution, skill, and sometimes sheer bravery. Villagers learned to use noise, fire, and traps to deter predators, turning danger into an opportunity for skill development. Tales of narrow escapes, clever strategies, and cooperative defense became part of the oral history, instructing others while reinforcing respect for the untamed wilderness. Even in death, the cold imparted lessons. Bodies preserved in ice, whether by accident or circumstance, became grim markers of hazard. Their discovery served as warnings, shaping routes, behaviors, and community practices. Medieval people in these regions developed a deep awareness of mortality's proximity, leading to both practical caution and philosophical reflection. Life in these frozen expanses was a constant dialogue between risk and preparation, and survival demanded a holistic understanding of the environment. Through centuries, these narratives, hunters' exploits, travelers' endurance, storms survived at sea, and communities overcoming extreme winters formed a collective memory. They were not mere stories of individual heroism, but records of communal adaptation, a testament to the interplay of ingenuity, skill, and human resilience. The coldest regions of the medieval world were harsh, unyielding, and indifferent, yet they fostered a remarkable capacity for endurance, cooperation, and quiet heroism. Here, survival was elevated to art. Each act, whether constructing a temporary shelter, rationing scarce food, tracking game through snow, or navigating frozen rivers, reflected accumulated wisdom passed through families and communities. The lessons embedded in these stories were as valuable as any material wealth, guiding villagers and travelers alike through the long, merciless winters. Even amid scarcity, isolation, and danger, there was a strange rhythm and beauty. The crackle of a hearth fire, the subtle glow of ice under moonlight, the soft tracks of animals across snow, and the steady perseverance of human hands against the elements formed a narrative both humbling and inspiring. Survival, in these tales, was not only about physical endurance, it was about observation, patience, ingenuity, and respect for the environment's formidable power. In the memory of communities, these stories endured, shaping both practical behavior and cultural identity. Young and old alike learned that winter, while merciless, could be met with preparation, cleverness, and courage. The legends were not just accounts of extreme hardship. They were maps of survival, charts of wisdom, and reminders that even in the coldest reaches, human ingenuity and perseverance could prevail. And so, the stories of hunters, travelers, families, and entire villages collectively illustrate the extraordinary capacity of medieval northern communities to survive, adapt, and even thrive amid conditions that might seem insurmountable to outsiders. Each tale, recounted around fires or during shared labor, reinforced the values of resourcefulness, endurance, and cooperation lessons that were essential not just for survival, but for the continuation of life itself in the frozen north. As the medieval winters pressed deeper across the northern reaches, survival stories grew in scope, encompassing not just individuals, but entire communities, their ingenuity and determination recorded in the quiet memory of those who endured. These tales, though rarely written with flourish, carried a cinematic weight, revealing the extraordinary lengths to which humans would go when faced with the relentless cold. Here, endurance was not an abstract virtue, it was a daily necessity, learned in practice, passed through example, and celebrated quietly among peers. Villages became living examples of adaptation, their layout, construction, and routines designed to withstand months of frozen isolation. Paths were deliberately maintained, roof structures reinforced against snow accumulation, and communal fire pits ensured warmth for multiple households. Even the simplest of gestures, stacking firewood in an accessible pattern, layering straw around doors, or checking the insulation of barns, became part of a collective choreography of survival. Outsiders might see a frozen, silent settlement, but those who lived there recognized the intricate rhythms and interdependencies that kept life moving. Travel across these regions was a feat that required both courage and careful planning. Couriers and traders often faced whiteout conditions that could erase paths in minutes. Survival depended on a precise understanding of terrain and weather, as well as the ability to improvise. Simple tools, sleds, snowshoes, or poles could mean the difference between life and death. Long journeys through mountain passes or along frozen rivers became the crucible in which young men and women honed endurance, spatial awareness, and resourcefulness, learning the subtle signs that heralded storms or thin ice. Maritime survival offered its own legendary tales. In the North Atlantic, winter storms could arrive with little warning, transforming calm waters into a swirling, icy chaos. Crews aboard longboats or small fishing vessels were often forced to improvise, using sails as windbreaks, reinforcing hulls against ice buildup, and taking shelter in narrow inlets where the waves were less treacherous. These feats were communal, each crew member relying on the skill of the others to navigate treacherous waters. When a vessel survived the storm, the story spread through coastal villages, enhancing the collective knowledge and confidence of future generations. Some of the most remarkable stories involve the ingenuity of ordinary villagers in extreme situations. One account describes a small family cut off from their neighbors for weeks by snowdrifts reaching the eaves. With food running dangerously low, they constructed a windbreak using sled frames, fir hides, and brushwood, creating a pocket of warmth around their dwelling. They rationed dried fish and stored snow to melt into water, maintaining hydration despite the frozen landscape. By reading subtle signs, wind direction, the faint echo of distant avalanches, and animal behavior, they managed to avoid hazards that could have proved fatal. Children played a crucial role in survival. Young members of the community were taught early to manage small but critical tasks, tending fires, checking stored provisions, maintaining warm clothing, and assisting in animal care. These lessons were integrated seamlessly into daily life, creating a generation adept at understanding and respecting the harsh environment. The survival of children was not merely a parental concern, it was a communal investment. Every small action, every taught skill, was a layer of protection against the merciless winter. Hunting expeditions formed another rich vein of legendary survival. Hunters tracking reindeer or elk had to navigate deep snow, hidden ice, and predatory animals. A misstep could lead to frostbite, falls, or encounters with wolves. Yet successful hunts offered more than sustenance. They provided hides for clothing, bones for tools, and fat for fuel. Every hunt became a testament to observation, patience, and intimate knowledge of the land. Tales of hunters enduring blizzards while carrying their game back to village shelters became instructional lore, emphasizing resilience and resourcefulness. Community response to extreme events further cemented legendary status. When sudden snowstorms trapped travelers or isolated a village, Neighbors rallied. They shared provisions, dug paths through deep drifts, and kept watch for those at risk of frostbite or hypothermia. These collective efforts were a silent, yet powerful demonstration of human endurance, cooperation, and empathy. Survival was rarely the act of a lone hero. It was the orchestration of many hands, minds, and hearts, bound together by necessity and experience. Encounters with wildlife often shaped survival stories. Wolves, bears, and lynx prowled the outskirts, their presence a constant reminder of the perilous balance between predator and prey. Villagers developed strategies to protect livestock, secure food, and avoid confrontation. Fires, noise, and makeshift traps became tools of defense, and stories of clever tactics were passed down as instruction for future generations. These narratives were imbued with respect for nature's power, teaching caution without fear, strategy without cruelty. Even the smallest acts of adaptation contributed to the survival lore. A traveler improvising snowshoes from carved wood, a villager melting ice for water, or a child learning to read the clouds for impending storms, all became part of a continuum of knowledge. In a frozen world, every gesture mattered. The rhythm of daily life, though slow and methodical, was punctuated by moments of ingenuity that allowed survival and, occasionally, triumph. Ultimately, the stories from the coldest regions of the medieval world reveal more than just physical endurance. They highlight human creativity, cooperation, and the intimate understanding of a harsh environment. They show how communities adapted, passed knowledge through generations, and celebrated small victories. Each story, whether of a hunter, a traveler, a sailor, or an entire village, serves as a testament to human resilience, reminding us that even amid relentless cold, life persisted, flourished, and left traces for the generations that followed. The quiet, enduring lessons of these stories continue to resonate. They are not grand epics of conquest, but subtle narratives of observation, patience, and care. In frozen landscapes where survival was never guaranteed, these tales captured the essence of human persistence, the intertwining of caution and courage, and the extraordinary capacity of people to meet adversity with skill, ingenuity, and quiet heroism. In the frozen landscapes of the medieval North, life was defined not by conquest or ceremony, but by endurance. The long, relentless winters shaped every choice, every habit, and every relationship between humans and their environment. By the time spring thawed the ice for even a brief season, communities had already internalized lessons learned through months of struggle, lessons in patience, ingenuity, cooperation, and the subtle art of surviving where the world itself seemed to conspire against them. These lessons were not abstract. They were woven into daily life, embedded in the routines of farming, fishing, hunting, and household management. The first and perhaps most crucial lesson was respect for the environment. Medieval Northerners knew that the landscape and climate could not be overcome by sheer will alone. Frozen rivers, snow-laden forests, and shifting ice demanded observation and attentiveness. Travelers learned to read subtle signs, the texture of the snow, the direction of the wind, the behavior of animals. Hunters tracked reindeer by barely visible footprints. Fishermen judged the thickness of ice by its color and sheen. These practices required constant vigilance, and they instilled a quiet humility, a recognition that survival was contingent upon partnership with, rather than domination over, the natural world. The built environment reflected this understanding. Houses, barns, and storage facilities were designed with meticulous care. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow, while walls were thickly insulated with timber, turf, and straw. Hearths were strategically placed to provide maximum warmth, and communal spaces allowed families to conserve heat while maintaining social connection. Even in the harshest weather, the architectural adaptations conveyed a deeper lesson, that human ingenuity could shape the world just enough to coexist with its extremes, turning vulnerability into resilience Clothing, too, was a medium of knowledge and adaptation. Generations had refined the use of layered furs, wools, and skins, learning not only how to trap warmth, but also how to move comfortably in cold conditions. Every garment told a story of seasonal preparation, of resourcefulness in patching or repurposing materials, and of careful attention to detail. People understood that their bodies were as much instruments of survival as any tool or shelter. Young children were taught early to respect these layers, and their mastery became a rite of passage, a practical initiation into the rhythms of the frozen world. Food systems embodied lessons in foresight, creativity, and cooperation. From early summer harvests to winter storage, communities learned to plan months in advance. Preservation techniques, smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, were perfected not for luxury but for necessity. In extreme scarcity, imagination became critical. Roots, mosses, lichens, and even powdered fish skins supplemented diets. Yet these adaptations were not merely stopgaps. They were the distilled knowledge of centuries, encoded in recipes, habits, and communal memory. They emphasized discipline, patience, and respect for the limits imposed by nature. Community cohesion emerged as another essential lesson. In the medieval North, survival was rarely solitary. Families, neighbors, and extended networks collaborated in ways that transcended formal hierarchy. Fires were shared, paths dug through drifts, and provisions pooled to safeguard the most vulnerable. These acts of mutual support reinforced social bonds, creating interdependence that strengthened both morale and practical survival outcomes. The cold, paradoxically fostered intimacy, reminding communities that life persisted only when each member contributed to the whole. Stories told beside hearths, during brief festivals, or in the quiet of early morning were repositories of wisdom. Tales of hunters braving blizzards, fishermen navigating icy seas, or children performing small but critical tasks were more than entertainment. They were pedagogical, encoding strategies, cautionary advice, and ethical lessons. Generations absorbed these narratives, internalizing them as guidance for behavior, decision-making, and moral conduct. In this way, history became lived experience, passed orally and practically, rather than written in chronicles alone. Another lesson lay in mental resilience. Harsh climates imposed monotony and isolation, yet those who thrived developed mental disciplines. They cultivated patience, creativity, and adaptability, often finding solace in repetitive tasks, quiet reflection, or the small triumphs of daily life. Skills in observation, problem-solving, and improvisation were prized not for abstract achievement, but for tangible survival. Even leisure gardening, crafting, or simple games served as mental training, reinforcing focus and emotional stability amid a harsh environment. Seasonal cycles shaped perception of time. In regions where daylight dwindled to near nothing in winter, people learned to adapt sleep, work, and ritual to light's rhythms. They internalized patterns, aligning activity with natural cues rather than clocks, understanding that patience and timing were as crucial to survival as any tool or provision. The cold taught them a unique temporality, one defined not by speed or productivity but by endurance, care, and attentiveness. Ultimately, these lessons combined to form a profound cultural legacy. Medieval Northerners developed a deep knowledge of their environment, passed through observation, labor, and storytelling. Their survival strategies, architectural, sartorial, nutritional, communal, and psychological, were testaments to human adaptability. They demonstrated that even in the harshest conditions, people could flourish, not in abundance but in harmony with limits, crafting lives marked by ingenuity, resilience, and quiet dignity. As the final winter thawed, leaving behind glistening rivers, ice-sculpted forests, and thawing soil, communities reflected on the patterns they had navigated. Every season, every storm, and every scarcity had reinforced lessons that could not be learned in warmer lands. Children matured into adept adults, carrying forward knowledge honed by necessity. Elders observed quietly, offering guidance rooted in decades of lived experience. And though the cold returned with certainty, the human spirit, tempered by it, endured with equal certainty. As winter's grip finally loosened, revealing glimmers of spring in the northern landscape, medieval communities paused to reflect on what the season had imparted. Survival in such harsh, frozen regions had demanded more than mere physical endurance. It had shaped culture, morality, and perspective. Families understood that each hardship, blizzards, scarcity, and the biting cold was not merely an obstacle but a teacher, instilling lessons that became integral to their identity. The slow, deliberate rhythm of life in these regions cultivated a resilience and awareness that would echo through generations. Architecture and settlement patterns testified to centuries of adaptation. Villages clustered tightly, maximizing warmth and mutual aid. Homes, barns, and communal spaces were carefully constructed to conserve heat and resist wind, demonstrating knowledge that had been refined through trial and error. Even the smallest details, a shuttered window, a packed layer of straw, a windbreak of stacked timber, revealed an intimate understanding of the environment. These structures were not merely shelters, they were embodiments of wisdom, symbols of the delicate dialogue between humans and the cold. Clothing, once a practical concern, became a language of survival and social knowledge. Layer upon layer, garments spoke of generations of trial, observation, and innovation. People could move confidently across frozen fields, climb icy slopes, or navigate snowbound trails because they had internalized principles of warmth, mobility, and protection. Every fur-lined glove, woolen cap, or leather boot was a testament to human ingenuity in the face of relentless nature. Young children were instructed not just in care but in the reasoning behind each layer, understanding that mastery over dress equated to mastery over survival itself. Food, forever central to existence, reflected a similar interplay between resourcefulness and endurance. Families had learned to anticipate scarcity months in advance, preserving the summer's bounty with meticulous care. Salted fish, smoked meats, dried berries, and fermented roots were not merely sustenance, they were carefully calibrated stores of energy, life, and stability. The act of eating became ritualized, measured, and communal. Meals reinforced bonds, shared knowledge, and the importance of vigilance. Even in lean times, the preparation, consumption, and preservation of food embodied centuries of observation, practice, and cultural wisdom. Community cohesion remained vital. Harsh climates demanded interdependence, as no individual could withstand the elements alone. Shared labor, clearing snow, tending animals, hunting, or fishing strengthened social networks, while mutual aid in times of scarcity forged trust and reliance. Celebrations, small though they might be, reinforced these connections, providing respite and reaffirming collective endurance. In these northern settlements, human relationships became as critical to survival as firewood or warm clothing, demonstrating that adaptation extended beyond technique into the very fabric of society. Storytelling, oral history, and memory provided the connective tissue for lessons learned. Elders recounted tales of survival, of cunning hunters, clever builders, and daring fishermen. These narratives were more than entertainment. They encoded wisdom, cautionary lessons, and practical techniques, preserving knowledge in the absence of widespread written records. Each story reinforced values of patience, observation, courage, and adaptability, ensuring that knowledge passed seamlessly from one generation to the next. The narrative of the cold became inseparable from the narrative of community. The natural world itself offered continual instruction. Snowdrifts revealed hidden dangers and the routes of animals. Ice thickness dictated travel. Wind and sky predicted storms. Those who thrived did so not through domination, but through careful attention, respect, and response to environmental cues. Observation became a daily practice, a form of intelligence that rivaled any formal education. Life in the coldest regions demanded that humans be perpetual learners, attentive to nuance and responsive to change. Mental resilience, cultivated through monotony, isolation, and challenge, proved equally essential. Daily routines, repetitive though they might seem, were exercises in focus, patience, and endurance. Crafting, spinning, mending, or tending animals in the cold hours required not only skill, but the capacity to persist when immediate rewards were minimal. In this way, the mind and body were trained in tandem, forging habits and strengths that carried through both winter and life beyond the snowbound village. As seasons cycled, each returning winter reinforced and refined these lessons. Children grew into adults, adept at clothing themselves, gathering and preserving food, navigating frozen terrain, and sustaining communal ties. Adults passed knowledge to the next generation not only through instruction but through example, demonstrating the rhythm and discipline necessary to thrive. What outsiders might perceive as simple subsistence was, in truth, a sophisticated adaptation, honed over centuries and sustained by observation, tradition, and necessity. By the time the sun returned to linger in the northern skies, people had internalized patterns of survival, the ebb and flow of cold and warmth, scarcity and abundance. Their lives, while harsh by modern standards, reflected a deep understanding of the environment and a quiet dignity in perseverance. They had learned that survival in extreme conditions was not merely about overcoming nature, but about coexisting with it, responding wisely, and respecting its rhythm. In these frozen regions, the lessons of the cold extended beyond survival. They influenced culture, ritual, ethics, and social organization. Every storm navigated, every meal preserved, every child taught the value of layered clothing contributed to a body of wisdom, an unbroken lineage of human ingenuity. And in this way, the medieval inhabitants of the North left a legacy that persists in the archaeological record, in oral traditions, and in the subtle ways human communities have learned to endure and thrive in challenging environments. Finally, as winter faded and spring breathed life back into the land, the people paused in reflective stillness. Rivers shimmered, forests creaked as ice thawed, and meadows slowly emerged from snow. Yet even as warmth returned, the lessons of the cold remained. They were imprinted not only in techniques and tools, but in mindset, in relationships, and in the enduring human spirit. Life in the coldest regions of the medieval world was harsh, exacting, and unyielding, but it produced communities of remarkable resilience, creativity, and cohesion. It was a world that demanded wisdom as much as strength, observation as much as endurance, and patience as much as action. Through frostbitten winters, scarce provisions, and frozen landscapes, medieval humans learned that survival was not simply a test of might, but a dance with the cold, an ongoing negotiation that shaped every aspect of life, leaving behind a legacy of adaptation, resourcefulness, and quiet triumph over adversity. And as the seasons continued their endless cycle, those who endured carried forward lessons that no harsh wind, deep snow, or ice-bound forest could ever erase. As we draw back from the frozen landscapes, the snow-laden forests, and the wind-swept tundras of medieval Europe and beyond, a quiet reflection emerges. Life in these harsh regions was not merely a struggle against cold, it was a rhythm, a slow, deliberate dance with the seasons, the land, and the ever-changing skies. The villages, the families, the hunters, the fishermen, all moved in subtle harmony with nature's demands, shaping their lives around what the cold would allow, anticipating its moods, and adapting with patient, persistent ingenuity. We have walked through homes warmed by smoke and straw, traced fingers over layers of wool, fur, and leather meticulously crafted for survival, and tasted in imagination the salted fish, dried meats, and root vegetables that sustained entire communities through months of frost. We have felt the tension of scarcity, the quiet triumph of ingenuity, and the resilience that bound people together against a relentless winter. These were not simply tales of hardship. They were stories of adaptation, of human creativity, and of enduring spirit in places where survival required more than strength. It required knowledge, observation, and deep respect for the land. The lessons from these medieval winters echo across centuries. We see them in the architecture that shields against wind, in clothing layered with intention, in communal bonds that endure under pressure, and in the careful stewardship of resources that sustains life even in scarcity. Every tale of frozen rivers, snowbound forests, or long nights by candlelight reminds us that human ingenuity is timeless, and that resilience is both learned and inherited. As the frost recedes and sunlight glimmers on thawing rivers, it is worth pausing to consider the quiet, powerful legacy of those who lived close to the cold. Their lives, measured in seasons, layered in preparation, and sustained by careful observation, leave traces in the patterns of history, in the artifacts of daily life, and in the enduring human capacity to thrive under constraint. If you have enjoyed this journey through the coldest regions of the medieval world, consider sharing this story. Like, subscribe, and join us again as we uncover more hidden histories, the quiet tales that shaped human life across centuries. For even in silence, in stillness, and in snow, history whispers its lessons, and through listening, we carry them forward.